Section 1 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kate Follis. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 6. Edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 1. Olivia de Castro. It is strange, and often lamentable, to consider the influence which public events have upon private fortunes. I do not now speak of the widows made by war, or of the other many and dreadful sufferings which that awful scourge inflicts upon humanity. The stream of the public destinies carries upon its bosom many a private shallop, sometimes aided by its current and adorned by its course of beauty, but far more often, after a long succession of perils, wrecked and utterly destroyed. Who but a soothsayer would have seen any connection between the fortunes of Herbert Meynell, the son of an English knight and dame, born and bred in England, and those of Donna Olivia de Castro, the daughter of a Spanish grande, whose only emigrations had been between her father's old castle and his palace at Madrid. And yet these two persons fixed the fate of each other's lives. And what brought them together? The course of public events. Sir Herbert Meynell's father had been one of those gentlemen of knightly families who bought the hereditary knighthood, which James I constituted for pecuniary purposes, under the title of baronet. He was a favourite of the king, and his son was bred up very much about the person of Prince Charles. Sir Herbert was thus, at the period of his father's death, which happened about the year 1620, when he was about 22 years old, far from being the coarse, uninstructed, unmannerly bumpkin which the mere country gentlemen of England almost universally were at that day. He had been bred about the court, and among the best even there. He had great natural advantages, and he cultivated them, whether of body or of mind, to the utmost. Accordingly, at the time he succeeded to the very large property of his father, another advantage, of the extent of which he was fully conscious. He was one of the most accomplished gallants of the court, in which he fixed his residence. Coming from the Midland, he had family connections with the Lord of the Ascendant, Buckingham, and although not by office one of his retainers, he was constantly about his person, and was considered as one of his most favoured followers. Accordingly, when that most extraordinary expedition, the Prince's journey to Spain, was resolved on, Sir Herbert was singled out as one of the galaxy of noble persons who were to go direct to Spain and form the retinue of the Prince during his residence at Madrid. Buckingham had originally wished that he should accompany them, but as their escort was limited to 3, Sir Francis Cottington, Sir Richard Graham, and Endymion Porter, this was found to be impossible. He went out, however, with Lord Denbigh, Lord Kensington, Lord Cecil, Lord Howard, and the other young nobles who formed the court of the Prince at Madrid. Never perhaps was more youth, beauty, wit, wealth, and rank congregated together than in this cortege. The Duke of Buckingham, whose eminence itself had originally arisen from his advantages of person, was at this time in the very zenith of manhood, and an unparalleled course of continued success had added all the animation, buoyancy, and brilliancy which are the usual attendants on good fortune. The young noblemen who had followed the Prince to Madrid were the very élite of the court. They had been singled out with reference to their showy and imposing qualities, and though the Prince himself already indicated that cold and reserved temper which afterwards proved of so much detriment during the course of his ill-fated life, yet it could scarcely have been possible for Francis I or Henri Quatre to have gathered around him a retinue more distinguished for grace, vivacity, and l'air de cour, but even among these Sir Herbert Meynell stood prominent. He was at this time scarcely 25, tall, graceful, and athletic in form, with the eye of a falcon, yet a smile soft, sweet, and penetrating as that of a woman, bred, too, under the eye of Buckingham, with this model of courtly grace and gallantry constantly in view. No wonder that he had imbibed much of that exquisite manner, which even his enemies admit Buckingham to have possessed, and still less wonder that he should also have contracted some of those vices which even his friends have never denied. Such was Sir Herbert Meynell at the time that he arrived at the court of Spain. In person and outward manner, what he was in heart, the following narrative will probably show. It was in the month of May, 1628, that a bullfight was held at Madrid for the purpose of displaying this national exhibition to the Prince of Wales. Splendidly as these shows were always got up, especially when honoured by the royal presence, the magnificence was redoubled on the present occasion, as may very naturally be supposed. And indeed, if the object were to display to the English prince an exhibition of Spanish character, no means so well calculated for the purpose could have been chosen. It went, indeed, a little farther than was intended, for all the points of that character that were displayed were not, perhaps, quite in consonance with the ideas of the prince. Certainly in those days a public bullfight might be considered as a condensation upon one spot of all the most prominent parts of the national disposition in Spain. The love of display, not the light, gay, and giddy feeling of the Frenchman, but more grave, more solid, I had almost said solemn, partaking rather of the nature of the tournament of old days than of the ballroom of modern times. With such feelings did the Spanish cavaliers enter the arena, dressed splendidly, but rigidly nationally, and casting up their eyes to the galleries, loaded with beauty, which stretched around the enclosures above, await with proudly swelling hearts the signal which was to give them the opportunity of exhibiting their persons and their prowess to such fair beholders. The Englishmen themselves, however, were warmly interested by the fine and daring spectacle which was passing before their eyes. As for its being cruel also, few people think the worse of any sport for that, even now. But then the very meaning of the term was not known by the great. Meynell alone saw but little of the fight. The bull made a splendid first rush, and as Sir Herbert was moving upward to get a fuller view of what would next happen, his eye lighted upon an object which put bull and cavaliers and matadors out of his head in an instant. It was a young lady of about 18. She was seated just outside the space enclosed for the court and its followers. Being a little in front where Meynell had been standing, he had not observed her till, as he was moving forward, a part of his dress becoming hitched upon the rail, he turned back to disengage it, and then his eyes rested full upon the loveliest face which, till then, they had ever beheld. The English court was, in the reign of James I, undoubtedly remarkable for the degree of beauty which adorned it, but Meynell felt in an instant anything so lovely as this he had never seen. She was speaking at the moment when Meynell first caught sight of her, and pointing out something in the arena to a lady who appeared to be her mother. The sweet, soft, and musical tone of her voice, the beauty of her lips as they moved in speaking, displayed from time to time the exquisite beauty within, the formation of the rounded and delicate arm as it was outstretched in the act of pointing, and, almost above all, the hand itself that pointed. The whole picture, in short, struck Meynell with the keenest admiration and delight. He stopped short, and after a few minutes drew near to the rail and sat down within a few paces of this enchanting vision. Sir Herbert had undoubtedly been, to use a homely but expressive phrase, somewhat taken aback by the sudden view of a creature so inexpressibly lovely, but he was not a man to lose his self-possession, or at least not speedily to regain it, even under such circumstances as these. He looked and looked again, to ascertain whether his first glance had deceived him. On the contrary, the more he gazed, the more he admired. His thoughts ran back to the memory of the English beauties whom he had wooed, but none could compare with this peerless Spaniard. He scanned the peculiar points of her national beauty, and thought them so many ingredients of perfection. The ideas which Byron has since put into such beautiful verse filled his mind. How much hath Phoebus wooed in vain to spoil her cheek, which glows yet smoother from his amorous clutch, who round the north for paler dames would seek, how poor their forms appear, how languid, wan, and weak. Meynell was not a man to let his admiration remain long unknown to its object. "I will wait," thought he, "a little while for an opportunity to accost her, and if it does not occur I will make one." It did occur, however, and that speedily. At first he was rather hampered by his difficulty in speaking Spanish, and he complained of his being a poor Englishman who had not been long enough in Spain to overcome his northern ignorance, in a manner which announced that he was one of the prince's suite, a fact which, as he well knew, was at that moment more likely to forward his suit with any lady in Madrid than if he had been a grande of the first class. But he did not yet know Olivia de Castro, or he would have felt how little impression such things as that made upon her mind. She relieved him, however, on the score of language, by asking him whether he spoke French. "My mother," she added, looking toward her, "is a Frenchwoman, and her language is consequently as familiar to me as my own." At this Sir Herbert was delighted, for he fully felt the exceeding disadvantage of having so faulty a weapon as a language which he imperfectly understood. "It is like fencing with one's left hand," said he to himself, "beside the chance of making some blunder so ridiculous as inevitably to cast a ridicule upon the speaker. Anything but that I could make head against, but if once the idea of ridicule falls upon a wooer, the die is cast. It is all in vain." The conversation now proceeded with animation. Donna Olivia was most curious about England and the English, their habits, their modes of thinking. "And they are all heretics?" she asked, crossing herself. "By far the greatest part," answered Sir Herbert. "But you see," he added, for he did not relish the tone in which she had spoken, or the look by which she had accompanied it, "you see that the animosities between Catholic and Protestant have all passed away. Here is our prince come over, like a knight of the olden time, to woo the king's fair sister, and the Pope himself is about to give his sanction to their union." "But still he is a heretic," said Donna Olivia thoughtfully, and almost as though thinking aloud. "Ah, sits the wind in that quarter," said Sir Herbert to himself. "It is hard, but I will trim my sails to meet it." "He has been so bred," he added. "Our religion is instilled into us in our youth, before we have means of judgment. We Protestants indeed have license to investigate, and if in so doing we found we had been trained in the wrong, we should undoubtedly embrace the right." "I, indeed," exclaimed Donna Olivia, and her eyes flashed as she turned them upon Sir Herbert, as though to scan him minutely. Meynell avoided the glance, but he saw it full well, and thoroughly read its expression. "I thought so," he said within himself. "That way lies my path, and may lead me far." It was little more than a month after the scene at the bullfight that the waning moon, as she shed her melancholy light upon the splendid garden of Don Guzman de Castro's palace, shone upon two figures who were in one of its rich alcoves. The lady's head was drooped upon her bosom, as she looked not toward her companion, who was leaning forward, and apparently speaking with great rapidity and earnestness. "Is it not enough, Olivia," he said, "that you have weaned me from the faith of my forefathers? Would you make me also untrue to my prince? No, our marriage must be secret, or it cannot be at all. If it were known that Sir Herbert Meynell, the follower and friend of Buckingham, was married to the Donna Olivia de Castro, there would, in this court of form and etiquette, be an end of the prince's negotiation at once. No, my love," he continued, softening his voice as he spoke, "our union must be secret. A few months past, and I may own you to be mine in the face of the world, and carry you to my own country, where you will reign the queen of beauty in the court, and the mistress of my soul and heart and happiness in our home." "Then why not wait till then?" said Olivia, in a low faltering tone, as though even when she asked it she was quite aware of the answer which her lover would make. "Trifle not with me thus," he exclaimed. "You know that in 3 days I shall have left Spain. I cannot assign to the prince the real cause of my reluctance, and he has singled me out to bear letters to the king. I must go, and can I go without putting it beyond the reach of fate that you should be mine? Can I go and leave you to the constant solicitations of Don Guzman that you should marry the Conde? How can I know how soon they may be turned into commands and enforced by every species of severity?" "And could you doubt my truth, though they were?" said Olivia, turning her eyes full upon her lover's face, with a look that might have reassured the soul of Othello in his fiercest mood. But Meynell did not doubt. He knew full well that though she had tendered to her the throne of Spain and the Indies on the one hand, and that she were threatened with a dungeon on the other, the faith of Olivia de Castro, once plighted, would remain unbroken. Assurance was not his object, for he would not have doubted if he had gone. And moreover, he was not going. His journey to England was a fiction, invented to serve the very purpose to which he was applying it. For this crafty and corrupt courtier, this worthy pupil of his false and reckless master, Buckingham, heeded not the means, so the end were gained. Nay, when the end was such as that for which he was now striving, it would truly have been cause for wonder if any means had seemed to him forbidden. "Doubt you, dearest? No," he answered. "Doubt never can cross my breast with regard to you, but I know not what they do in Spain. I know only that strange things, such as we hear not of in England, are done. Fathers here have power inordinate, and they scruple little how they use it. Dearest, you must be mine before I leave Madrid. If not, I cannot go in peace. If not, I cannot go at all." "Yes," he continued, as though he were wrought to a paroxysm of passion, "I will forfeit all, duty, country, friends, all, rather than leave you without having made you irrevocably mine." 5 short weeks before, and Olivia de Castro had never seen Herbert Meynell. He now was master of her whole soul. He had begun by letting her have hopes that he might be won from his heretic faith, and that thus a soul might be won for heaven. With consummate art had he led her on and on by degrees, feigning that his mind was more and more moved, while he assured himself of the reality that hers was so. They met almost daily. The religious motive which Meynell had, with the subtlety of the fiend, given her wherewith to deceive herself, blinded her at first, but long before the conversion was completed, she felt that she loved with that fierce intensity, that overflowing tenderness, that fixed unity with which a soul like hers could alone love. Let not the reader smile at the short time that sufficed to effect this. We all know, it is well if we have not experienced, that in some situations years are condensed into months, nay, weeks. Feelings which would be spread over the whole life of the cold and the cautious are often accumulated and compressed into 1 hour of intense sensation. When Meynell saw that the blow was stricken, that her mind and heart were his beyond the power of recall, he allowed the work of proselytism to go on more rapidly, and her full fervent confession of unrepressed, irrepressible love was made, as she believed, to a Catholic. Still she hesitated. Both the difficulties and duties of her position hampered her, and it needed the feigned mission to England to hurry her into the fatal step of a private marriage. That once secured, Meynell, of course, was no longer compelled to leave Spain. The almost delirium of joy with which she received the intelligence that he was to remain touched for a moment the heart of this wicked and cruel man. For an instant remorse stung him to the quick, and as he pressed her to his bosom and fondly kissed her brow, the truth hovered on his lips. He was on the point of telling her all, but the habits of evil years proved too strong for the repentant impulse of one moment. He held his peace. It was within a few days after this that a painter was engaged to paint her portrait. Velasquez did not know who the lady was that came secretly to sit to him, but concluding it to appertain to one of the love adventures so common at Madrid, he was contented with having painted one of the loveliest faces that artist ever transferred to canvas, and made no inquiries. To suit some whim of Meynell's, the lady was dressed in the Greek costume. A droll whim, thought Velasquez. But what was it to him, the painter? The lady wondered as much, but she was very gentle, very kind. Anything to gratify her husband, anything but become a heretic. For a certainty she would rather have been painted in the costume of her own beloved country, and for a certainty it would have been equally as picturesque. But men have sometimes strange notions. This was one of them. It is a head, thought the great master, worthy of being, and it shall be the finest that ever passed from my pencil. What a radiant creature! He exclaimed one day, as he stood gazing on the unfinished work, at the hour he expected his sister. That brow, how noble! Those eyes, how beaming with the fire of youth and health, and with a keen, deep, and all-pervading happiness also. How that spirit pervades the whole face and gives it life and brilliancy. This must be love, happily fortuned love. Naught else could shed such radiance upon such a countenance. Alas, how seldom is it thus! But so glorious a creature as this indeed deserves it. The expression of the eye was less bright today, thought the painter, as he looked at the progress of the picture after the sitter was gone. I did not much perceive it at the time, but I copied closely, exactly, the impression that was there, and certainly the countenance is a little clouded. It may have been error. I may have gazed upon those eyes till, without a figure, they dazzled me, and the very beauty of their light may have prevented my rendering it. I will be very careful next time. He was so, but the diminished brightness was, this time, beyond doubt. It was distinctly perceptible as she sat, and still more so in the portrait after she was gone. "The character of this piece is altering visibly," thought Velasquez, as he closely examined the picture. "This is not as it was. I had thought that I should have executed the most radiant countenance that my art has ever yet embodied, but this will not be so now. It is beautiful, most beautiful still, perhaps even more so than before, but it is saddened and subdued. Alas! It is not as wont. Love's brilliant morning has become clouded over ere noon. Pray heaven a storm do not supervene ere sunset." And what could have changed the whole character of that speaking countenance in so short a time? What could have reduced that heart from the delicious thrill which accompanies accomplished love to the dreary and desolate sensation which wrings it when it first discovers that even that is vanity? Was it in the nature of man thus to wound a creature such as this, whose lofty soul had become softened, whose ardent affection had been kindled into a blaze for him? Yes, so, alas, it was. The cold-hearted, if not cold-blooded, follower of Buckingham had already dashed the bloom from this fair flower, and it was drooping before his eyes. The gradations by which Donna Olivia's misery came upon her were very similar in kind with those through which her love had grown. Soon after their marriage, when the prize was won, when this lovely and gifted creature was irrevocably his, and his joys were lodged beyond the reach of fate, Sir Herbert began to tire of the constant and minute hypocrisy that was necessary to keep up in his wife the belief that he really had become a convert to the Catholic faith. The first time a doubt of this crossed her mind was probably the bitterest moment Olivia had undergone. Her religious feelings were such as might be expected in a Spaniard of that age, with the addition that that Spaniard was a woman of the strongest feelings and passions, and that up to that period religion had been the only object they had to feed on. And even when that supreme and paramount passion, love, had taken possession of her breast, it had been, as it were, introduced by the agency of religion. Its progress had been accompanied by religious thoughts and anxieties, and its climax had been almost simultaneous with the completion of the conversion which had gone on with its gradations. She felt, too, that this was her work. She felt that she had saved the soul of the man whom she adored. What, then, must have been her agony when first his manner made her doubt whether his proselytism were real? We, in these days, and of the Protestant faith, can scarcely understand the degree of exclusiveness which Catholics then attached to their creed. "He is a heretic, and therefore must be damned eternally." Such was the immediate and necessary conclusion to which every mind came when once the, to them, awful fact was established that he was a heretic. As this doubt increased within Olivia's mind, her soul sickened, and her spirit drooped. The eternal salvation of him whom she loved almost as her own was in jeopardy, and as though this idea were not misery enough to crush her heart, she could not conceal from herself that he had played the hypocrite. "And yet, no," she thought, "that cannot be. He is too noble, too honorable, too true. His love for me blinded his reason and carried him forward beyond the reality. He thought that he believed. It was his overwhelming passion that deceived him. But alas, she soon found that whatever that passion might have been, it now undoubtedly had no such violent influence upon his mind. He grew impatient and testy when she urged the subject of religion, and in his heat would say things which stabbed her to the heart's core, and lay there corroding it into torture, while he, light, careless, and cold, had forgotten he had ever so spoken. Indeed, as the prince's stay at Madrid drew toward an end, Sir Herbert's behaviour changed so completely as to open the eyes of the unhappy Donna Olivia at last. "He loves me no more. He never could have loved me." For Sir Herbert began to talk of the necessity of his accompanying the Duke of Buckingham on his return to England, and of the impracticality of Donna Olivia coming at the same time. It is strange that though this wounded every feeling of her sensitive nature, yet lofty and even haughty in mind as she had always previously been, she did not display, under her lover's coolness, the slightest tinge of that fierceness and violence which women of such temperament usually show under ill requital. No, she was totally subdued, broken. She had staked all upon one cast and lost it, and her heart and hope and energy and fire were all gone at once. Sometimes, even yet, she could scarcely believe her misfortune to be real. Not love me? It's impossible. When I think, on what he has said on this very spot, it is impossible. I have become gloomy and depressed on the score of his religion, and that has made me fearful about all else. Love me? Oh, yes, yes. It is impossible that he should not. And thus, by the repetition of the words, "It is impossible," she strove to make herself believe it was so indeed. "I will come to a full understanding this night about the English voyage. If I do not accompany him, I shall not live to see him return." As she resolved, so she acted. She again implored him that he should take her with him. "Impossible," he said. "The prince goes wifeless from your shores. I am to sail in the same ship. It would seem a direct insult to his highness that I should take a Spanish wife in his company, as though to show that, though he could not strive in his wooing, I could. No, no, stay, Olivia, till the Infanta comes to England, and then avow our marriage, and come in her suite to join me." "Alas, Herbert, that will never be. You must feel that this match will never take effect. He is as I said," and she sighed heavily at the recollection, "as I said to you the first day we met. He is a heretic, and they will never come together." "Accursed be the word," said Meynell, who had latterly always nettled when his wife touched upon the subject of religion. "Heretic though he be, the Infanta of Spain would be but too rejoiced if she could keep him in her nest, and Don Philip would resign the political point nearest to his heart to call the Prince of Wales his brother. Think you, then, they will break off the match on a point of faith?" "Be it so or not," Olivia answered sadly, almost solemnly, "the match will be broken off. Therefore can I never accompany the Infanta to England. Herbert, I must go with you. What do you think, when this concealment preys upon me so heavily? Do you think I can support it when you are gone, when I have no longer these dear meetings to look to repay me for all I struggle through during the day? Do you think I could live?" "Olivia," Meynell answered, "this is wild and wicked talk. It is imperative upon me, under the circumstances in which I am placed, to go to England without you. But you may follow ere long. And to talk thus of the effect of an absence of a few months is, I repeat, but unwise and wrong. A few months? Alas, those months I shall never live to see in Spain. Herbert, is it possible that you can be willing to leave me? Is it, oh God, is it true, as I have sometimes feared, and the thought has almost driven me to madness, that you wish it? Oh, no, 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 it cannot be. You will take me with you, Herbert, won't you? It is, I fear, but too true that, when love is once passed away, those endearments and strong appeals to feeling, which would but some short time before have thrilled through the very soul, even revolt him to whom they are addressed. He shrinks from them, to say the least, with a sensation of uneasiness and pain. And thus it was with Herbert Meynell, who answered his unhappy victim far more coldly than, did not one know to what man's nature, under such circumstances, can reach, one would suppose to have been possible. At length Olivia became maddened. All the slumbering pride of her nature burst forth into action and life at once. False and transitory as the impulse was, it impassioned her whole being for the moment, and starting from the almost caressing posture in which she had hitherto been, sprang upon her feet and exclaimed, "Then, sir, I will go with you. I am your wife, and you shall not leave me. If you are lost to all honor, humanity, and shame, I will go to your prince, and he shall hear my story. He will tell me whether or no his presence forbids his followers to take with them their wives. He will tell me." "He will tell you, madam," interrupted Meynell, stung to fury in his turn by her threat of appealing to the prince, but compressing his rage into a sneer the devil himself might have envied as he spoke. "He will tell you, madam, that you are not my wife. He will tell you that I am already married in England." Olivia stood, as though stricken by the hand of heaven, motionless and speechless. But after the lapse of some seconds a scream, dissonant and terrific, as is always the voice of human anguish, carried beyond the extremest pitch of human power to endure, burst from her, and she fell headlong upon the earth. It was the last sound that was ever uttered by her lips. End of section 1.
Section 2 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 6, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 2, The Comet, by Henry Neele, Esquire. A few years ago, at the little fishing town, or rather village, of G, on the coast of Cornwall, resided a gentleman who, from his appearance, might be estimated to be nearly 60 years of age. But I have since learned that he was not more than 40. Whatever his age might be, he was more than suspected to be the old gentleman, that is to say, no other than the devil himself. Now I, who happened to be obliged for the arrangement of some family affairs to reside a month or two at G, had the misfortune to differ from my worthy neighbours as to the identity of the occupant of the old manor house with the enemy of mankind. In the first place, his dress bore no sort of resemblance to that of Beelzebub. The last person who had the good fortune to get a glimpse of the real devil was the late Professor Porson, and he has taken the pains to describe his apparel very minutely, so that I am enabled to speak with some degree of confidence upon this part of the subject. The professor's description runs thus: "And pray, how was the devil dressed? Oh, he was in his Sunday's best. His coat was black, and his breeches were blue, with a hole behind that his tail went through. And over the hill and over the dale, and he rambled over the plain, and backwards and forwards he switched his long tail, as a gentleman switches his cane." The compliment externe of the old gentleman at Chi was quite the reverse of all these. In the first place, he had no Sunday's best. The Sabbath and the working day saw him in precisely the same habiliments, a circumstance which confirmed the townspeople in their opinion, whereas I have no less an authority than that of Porson for deducing an opposite conclusion from the same premises, because the devil is scrupulously particular about his Sunday's apparel. Then again, he was never seen in a coat, but always wore a loose morning gown. This, however, was a circumstance which, in the opinion of all, told decidedly against him. For why should he always wear that gown, unless it was for the purpose of hiding his tail beneath its ample folds? The good wives of the town were especially pertinacious upon this point, and used to eye the lower part of the old gentleman's garment very suspiciously as he took his morning's walk upon the beach. As to his rambling over hill and dale, in the manner mentioned by the learned professor, that was quite out of the question, for he was a great sufferer by the gout, and wore bandages as large as a blanket round his leg. Whenever this fact was mentioned, the gossips used to smile, shake their heads, and look particularly wise, observing that it was clearly a stratagem which he resorted to for concealing his cloven foot. Another circumstance ought not to be omitted. He never went to the parish church, the only place of worship within 20 miles, and after he left G, an ivory crucifix was found in his house, over which there was no doubt, in the opinion of the neighbours, that he used to say the Lord's Prayer backwards, and repeat a variety of diabolical incantations. I ventured humbly to suggest that his absence from church and the discovery of the crucifix were proofs, not that he was a devil, but a Catholic, upon which I was interrupted with a sneer and an exclamation of, "Where is the mighty difference?" He gave great offence at the house of a fisherman who lived near him, and strongly confirmed the prejudices against him by tearing down a horseshoe which was nailed at the door as a protection against witchcraft, and calling the inhabitants fools and idiots for their pains. Seeing, however, the consternation which he had created, he laughed heartily, and gave them a guinea to make amends. The good folks were determined not to derive any pecuniary advantages from the devil's gold, but they gave it to their last-born, an infant in arms, as a plaything. The child was delighted with the glittering bauble, but one day, having got it down its throat, there it stuck, and instant suffocation ensued. The weeping and wailing of the family on this occasion were mingled with execrations on the author of the calamity, for such they did not hesitate to term the old gentleman who had evidently thrown to them this infernal coin for the purpose of depriving them of their chief earthly comfort. They were not long in proceeding to the nearest magistrate, and begging him to issue his warrant to apprehend the stranger for murder. To this, however, his worship demurred, and the good folks changed their battery, and begged to ask, as the guinea was of course a counterfeit, whether they could not hang the devil for coining. To this his worship replied, that though coining is an offence amounting to high treason, yet the devil, not being a natural-born subject of his majesty, owed him no allegiance, and therefore could not be guilty of the crime in question. The poor people departed, thinking it all very odd, and that the people and the squire must be in collusion. in which opinion they were confirmed by a tallow chandler, who was the chief tradesman of the town, as well as a violent radical, and who advised to petition the House of Commons without delay. I will explain to my readers the secret of the tallow chandler's enmity. The old gentleman had of a sudden ceased to buy candles, and illuminated his house inside and out in a strange and mysterious manner by some means which, from the brimstone-like smell occasionally perceived, were plainly of infernal origin. For several weeks previously he had been employing labourers from a distant town, for he did not engage the honest man, whose pickaxe was the only one ever used by the good people of G, in digging trenches and laying down pipes round his house. The townsfolk gazed on in wonder and terror, but at a careful distance, and although they had a longing desire to understand the meaning of all this, they cautiously avoided any intercourse with the only persons who could give them the least information, viz., the labourers who performed the work. At length, one night, without any obvious cause, the lamp before the old gentleman's door, that in his hall and another in his sitting-room, were seen to spring into light as if by magic. They were also observed to go out in the same way, and thereupon a smell which could not be of this world proceeded from them. One day, too, a dreadful explosion took place at the house, and a part of the garden wall was thrown down, all which were plain proofs that it could be no one but the devil who inhabited there. The good folks of G had never heard of gas or its properties, and I was thought to be no better than I should be for endeavouring to explain all these phenomena by natural causes. My own opinions were so much opposed to those of my neighbours that I felt rather a desire to be acquainted with the stranger, whose manners appeared to be open and good-humoured, although testy and eccentric. My naturally shy disposition prevented me, however, from accomplishing my wish, and beside this I found that my own affairs were enough to occupy me during the short time that I remained at G. I learned that the person who had created so much consternation had arrived at that town about 4 months before, and that the house had been previously engaged for him. Who or what he was, or why he came thither, no one who tried could ascertain. Whether I could have attained this wonderful height in knowledge I do not know, but having something else to do, I never made the attempt. Many years rolled over my head, and the memory of the mysterious inhabitant of G had entirely vanished from it, when circumstances which it is unnecessary to detail obliged me to pay a visit to the north of Germany. At the close of a fine autumnal day in 18 , I found myself entering the splendid city of Berlin. Both my good steed and I were so much fatigued that a speedy resting was very desirable for us, but it was long before I could choose a hotel out of the immense number which presented themselves to my view. Some were far too magnificent for my humble means, and the mere sight of their splendour seemed to melt away the guilders in my pocket. Some, on the other hand, were such as no man of wit and fashion about town would think of putting his head into. At length I thought that I discovered one which looked like the happy medium, and the whimsicality of its sign determined me to put up there. The sign was Der Teufel, and since my departure from G I had acquired a sufficient mastery of the German language to know what those two words signified in English. I entered, and after taking all due precautions for the accommodation and sustenance of the respectable quadruped who had borne me upon his back for nearly half a day, I began to think of satisfying that appetite which disappointment, anxiety, and fatigue had not been able entirely to destroy. My worthy host, who did not seem to bear any resemblance to his sign, unless I could have the ingratitude to ascribe his magical celerity and marvellous good fare to the auspices of his patron saint, quickly covering my table with a profusion of tempting viands, while a flask of sparkling Hockheim towered proudly like a presiding deity above the whole. My good humour, however, was a little clouded when I saw plates, knives, and forks laid for 2 instead of 1. What means this? Said I to the landlord. Mein Herr, he answered submissively, a gentleman who has just arrived will have the honour of dining with you. But I mean to dine alone, I replied angrily, not that I doubted the sufficiency of the meal, but I did not choose to be intruded upon by strangers. Pardon me, mein Herr, said the landlord with unabashed impudence. I have told Herr von Schwarzmann that dinner is ready. I'm sure you will like his company. He is a gentleman of good fortune and family. He is moreover— I care not who he is, I exclaimed, but in order to cut thy prating short and to get my dinner, if I must needs submit, let him come in at once, even if he be the devil himself. I had scarcely uttered these words when I started as if I had really seen the person whom I mentioned, for the room door opened, and in walked the old gentleman who had caused so much wonder and terror at G. The superstitions of the people of that town, the sign of the inn where I now was, the old fellow's name, Schwartzmann, which being interpreted in English meaneth black man, my own petulant exclamation, and the sudden apparition of this unaccountable person, were circumstances that crowded my brain at once, and for an instant I almost fancied myself in the presence of the foul fiend. You seem surprised, at length said Herr von Schwarzmann, at our unexpected meeting, and indeed you cannot be more so than I am. I believe it was in England that we met before. Even so, mein Herr, I answered, encouraged by the earthly tone of his voice, and fancying that the good-humoured smile which mantled over his face must be of this world, and at any rate could be of no worse origin. Even so, mein Herr, and I have often regretted that, placed as we were among a horde of barbarous peasantry, an opportunity never occurred for our better acquaintance. It is at length arrived, he said, filling 2 glasses of Hockheim. Let us drink to our better and our long acquaintance. I pledged the old gentleman's toast with great alacrity, and it was not until the passage of the wine down my throat had sealed me to it irrevocably that I reflected upon the sentiment to which I had drunk with so much cordiality, and I was again shaken with doubts as to the nature of the person with whom I had avowed my wish to be long and intimately acquainted. I looked upon his feet, but that's a fable, and then I looked upon the viands on which he was feeding lustily, while I, although he had the courtesy to load my plate with the best of everything, was wasting the golden moments in idle alarms and superstitious absurdity. The more reasonable man was roused within me, and I fell to the work of mastication with a zeal and fervour that would have done honour to Dr. Kitchener himself. Well, my friend, said my companion, after we had pretty well satisfied the cravings of our stomachs, our landlord has this day treated us nobly, and methinks we have not been backward in doing honour to his excellent cheer. He is an honest fellow who well deserves to prosper, and we will therefore, if you please, drink success to der Teufel. I had raised my glass to my lips when I found that the old gentleman meant to propose a toast, but I set it down hastily as soon as I heard the very equivocal sentiment to which he wanted me to pledge myself. The fiend, I thought, is weaving his web around me, and wishes me to drink to my own perdition. A cold sweat came over me, a film covered my eyes, and I thought that I perceived the old man looking askew at me, while his lip was curled with a malignant smile. You are not well, he said, taking my hand. I shrunk from his grasp at first, but to my surprise it was as cool and healthy as the touch of humanity can possibly be. Let us retire to our worthy host's garden. The heat of this room overpowers you, and we can finish our wine coolly and pleasantly in the arbour. He did not wait for my consent, but led me out, and our bottle and glasses were very quickly arranged upon a table in a leafy arbour, where we were sheltered from the sun, and enjoyed the refreshing fragrance of the evening breeze, as it gently stirred the leaves about us. They were odd people, said my friend, those inhabitants of G. They stared at me, and shrunk from me, as if I had been the devil himself. And in truth, mein Herr, I replied, they took you to be no less a personage than he whom you have just named. The old gentleman laughed long and heartily at my information. I thought as much, he said. It is an honour which has been ascribed to me from the hour of my birth, and in more countries than one. "Indeed," said I, "you speak as if there were something in your history to which a stranger might listen with interest. May I crave the favour of you to be a little more communicative?" "With all my heart," he replied. "But in truth you will not find much to interest you in my story. A little mirth and a good deal of sorrow make up the history of most men's lives, and mine is not an exception to the general rule. I was born some 60 years ago, and was the son and heir of the Baron von Schwarzmann, whose castle in a few miles to the southward of this city, and I am now, by your leave, Mynheer, the Baron himself." I made a lower bow than I had ever yet greeted him with. My mother had brought into the world, about 2 years previously, a daughter of such extraordinary beauty that it was confidently expected that the next child would be similarly endowed. But I was no sooner presented to my father than he was so startled at my surprising ugliness that he retreated several paces and involuntarily exclaimed, "The devil!" This was a Christian name which stuck to me ever afterward, and which, as you can bear witness, followed me even into a foreign country. My godfather and godmother, however, treated me much more courteously than my own natural parent, and bestowed upon me at the baptismal font the high-sounding appellation of Leopold. Nothing worth describing occurred during the years of my infancy. I cried and laughed and pouted and sucked and was kissed and scolded and treated and whipped as often and with the same alternations as children in general. Only I grew uglier and justified the paternal benediction more and more every day. In due time I was sent to a grammar school, as I had at home been accustomed to independence and the exercise of my self-will. I soon became the most troublesome fellow there, and yet, I may now say it without the imputation of vanity, I contrived by some means or other to gain the hearts of all, whether tutors or pupils. For solving a theme, or robbing an orchard, writing nonsense verses, or frightening a whole neighbourhood, translating Homer into German verse, or beating a watchman until his flesh was one general bruise, who could compete with Leopold von Schwarzmann? One day I was publicly reprimanded and punished for some monstrous outrage, and the next rewarded with all the honours of the school for my proficiency in the classics. In short, it was generally agreed that there was not such another clever, pleasant, good-tempered, good-for-nothing fellow in the school. Certainly the wise people would say, "The devil is in him." "And now," added the old man, smiling, but smiling, I thought, somewhat solemnly and sadly, "I must let you into the secret of one of my weaknesses. I have ever had the most implicit belief in the science of astrology. You stare at me incredulously, and I can excuse your incredulity. You, born in England perhaps some 40 years ago, can have but few superstitions in common with one whose birthplace is Germany, and whose natal star first shone upon him above 60 years before the time at which he is speaking. Observe that comet," he said, pointing toward the west. "It is a very brilliant one, and this is the last night that it will be visible." "It is the beautiful comet," I said, "which has shone upon us for the last 6 months, and which first appeared, I think, in the belt of Orion." "True, true," replied the Baron. "It is the comet which, according to the calculations of astronomers, visits the eyes of the inhabitants of this world once in 20 years, and I can confirm the accuracy of their calculations as far as relates to 3 of its visits. You will smile and think that the eccentricity of my conduct and character is sufficiently accounted for when I tell you that that comet is my natal planet. On the very day and instant that it became visible, 60 years and 6 months ago, did I first open my eyes in my father's castle. There is, however, a tradition connected with this comet, which has sometimes made me uneasy. It runs thus: the comet that's born in the belt of Orion, whose cradle it gilds the place they shall die on. However, this is its 3rd return that I have seen, and being now as hale and hearty as ever I was, the tradition, if it means anything to interest me, means that I shall live on to the good old age of 80. But to return to my history, I was a fervent believer in astrology, and I thought that if I could meet with a person, either male or female, who was born under the same star, to that person I might safely attach myself, and our destinies must be indissolubly bound together. I had, however, never met with such a person, and as yet I had never seen my natal star, for on the day on which I entered the University of Hull, I wanted 3 days of attaining my 20th year. Those 3 days seemed the longest and most tedious that I had ever passed. But at length the fateful morning dawned, on the evening of which, a few minutes before the hour of 8, the hour of my birth, I hastened to a secluded place at a short distance from the town, and planting myself there, gazed earnestly and intently upon the belt of Orion. I had not gazed long before a peculiar light seemed to issue from it, and at length I saw a beautiful comet, with a long and glittering train, rising in all its celestial pomp and majesty. How shall I describe my feelings at that moment? I felt, as it were, new-born. New ideas, new hopes, new joys seemed to rush upon me, and I gave vent to my emotions in an exclamation of delight. This exclamation I was astonished to hear repeated as audibly and fervently as it was made, and turning round, I beheld a female within a few paces of me to my right. She was tall and exquisitely formed. Her dress denoted extreme poverty, and her eye, which for a moment had been lighted up with enthusiasm, was downcast and abashed with a sense of conscious inferiority when it met mine. Still I thought that I had never beheld a face so perfectly beautiful. Her general complexion was exquisitely fair, without approaching to paleness, with a slight tinge of the rose on each cheek, which I could not help thinking that care and tenderness might be able to deepen to a much ruddier hue. Her eyes were black and sparkling, but the long dark lashes which fell over them seemed, I thought, acquainted with tears. Her hair was of the same colour with her eyes, and almost of the same brightness. I gazed first upon her, and then upon the newly risen comet, and my bosom seemed bursting with emotions which I could not repress, or even understand. "Sweet girl," I said, approaching her, and taking her hand, "what can have induced you to wander abroad at this late hour?" "The comet," she said, "the comet," pointing to it with enthusiasm. "It is indeed a beautiful star," I replied, and as I gazed I felt as if I were the apostle of truth for so saying. "But here," I added, pressing my lip to her white forehead, "is one still more beautiful, but alas, more fragile, and which ought therefore not to be exposed to danger." "Ay," she said, "but it is the star which I have been waiting to gaze upon for many a long year. It is the star that rules my destiny, my natal star. 20 years ago, and at this hour, was I brought into the world." Scarcely could I believe my eyes. I thought that the sounds which I had heard could not have come from the beautiful lips which I saw moving, but that some lying fiend had whispered them in my ears. I made her repeat them over and over again. I thought of the desire which had so long haunted me, and which now seemed gratified. I thought, too, of the beautiful lines of Schiller. It is a gentle and affectionate thought, that in immeasurable heights above us, at our first birth, this wreath of love was woven, with sparkling stars for flowers. In short, I thought and felt so much that I fell at the fair girl's feet, told her the strange coincidence of our destinies, revealed to her my name and rank, and made her an offer of my hand and heart without any farther ceremony. "Alas, sir," she said, permitting, but not returning the caress which I gave her, "I could indeed fancy that fate has intended us to be indissolubly united, but I am poor, friendless, wretched. My mother's old and bedridden, and my father, I fear, follows desperate courses to procure even the slender means on which we subsist." "But I have wealth, sweet girl," I exclaimed, "sufficient to remove all these evils, and here is an earnest of it," endeavouring to force my purse into her hands. "Nay, nay," she said, thrusting it back, "keep your gold, lest slander should blacken the fair fame which is all Adeline's dowry." "Sweet Adeline, beautiful Adeline," I said, "do not let us part thus. Can you doubt my sincerity? Would you vainly endeavour to interpose a barrier against the decrees of fate? Believe that I love you, and say that you love me in return." "It is the will of fate," she said, sinking in my arms. "Why should I belie what is written in my heart? Leopold, I love thee." Thus did we, who but half an hour previously were ignorant of each other's existence, plight our mutual vows. but each recognized a being long sought and looked for, and each yielded to the overruling influence of the planet, which was the common governor of our destiny. I was anxious to celebrate our nuptials immediately, but Adeline put a decided negative upon it. "What," she said, "were you born under yon star, and know not the dark saying which is attached to it? The love that is born at the comet's birth, treat it not like a thing of earth. Breathe it to none but the loved one's ear, lest fate should remove what hope deems so near. Seal it not till the hour and the day when that star from the heavens shall pass away." I instantly recollected the saying, and acquiesced in the wisdom of not acting adversely to what I believed to be the will of destiny. "It will, then, be 6 long months, sweet Adeline," I said, "ere our happiness can be sealed, but I must see thee daily. I cannot else exist." "Call upon me at yon white cottage," she answered, "at about this hour. My father is then out. Indeed, he has been out for some weeks now, but he is never at home at that hour, and my mother will have retired to rest. Farewell, Leopold von Schwarzmann." "Farewell, dearest Adeline. Tell me no more of thy name. I seek not, I wish not to know it. Tell it not to me until the hour when thou art about to exchange it for Schwarzmann." Our parting was marked, as the partings of lovers usually are, with sighs and tears, and embraces, protestations of eternal fidelity, and promises of speedily seeing each other again. The love thus suddenly lighted up within our bosoms I did not suffer to die away or be extinguished. Every evening at the hour of 9 I was at the fair one's cottage door, and I ever found her ready to receive me. Nay, at length I used to find the latch left unfastened for me, and I stole upstairs to her chamber unquestioned. I soon discovered that her mind and manners were at least equal to her beauty, but the utmost penury and privation were but too visible around her. It was in vain that I offered her the assistance of my purse, and urged her to accept my anticipation that which must very shortly be hers by right. The high-minded girl positively refused to avail herself of this offer, and then I could not help at all hazards endeavouring to persuade her to consent to our immediate union, as that seemed to me to be the only means of rescuing her from the distressing state of poverty in which I found her. "Say no more, Leopold," she said one night when I had been urging this upon her more strenuously than ever. "Say no more, lest I should be weak enough to consent, and so draw down upon our heads the bolts of destiny. And, Leopold, I find thy presence dangerous to me. Let me, therefore, I pray thee, see thee no more until the hour which is to make us one. I dread thy entreating eyes, thy persuading tongue. 1 short month of separation, and then a whole life of constant union. Say that it shall be so for my sake." "It shall be so, it shall for thy sake," I said. For bitter as was the trial to which she put me, the tone and manner in which she implored my acquiescence were irresistible. "Then farewell," she said. "Come not near me until that day. Should you attempt to see me earlier, I have a fearful foreboding that something evil will befall us." This was the most sorrowful parting which I had yet experienced, but I bore it as manfully as I could. 3, 4, 5 days did I perform my promise, and never ventured near the residence of Adeline. I shut myself up in my own chamber, where I saw no one but the domestic who brought my meals. I could not support this life any longer, and at last I determined to pay a visit to Adeline. "Whither would you go, mine Herr?" said the sentinel at the city gate through which I had to pass. "I have business of importance to transact about a mile from the city," I answered. "Pray do not detain me." "Nay, mine Herr," replied the sentinel, "I have no authority to detain you, but if you will take the advice of a friend, you will not leave the city tonight. Know you not that the noted bandit Brant is suspected to be in the neighbourhood this evening, that the council have set a price upon his head, and that the city bands are now engaged in pursuit of him?" "Be it so," I said. "A man who is skulking about to avoid the city bands is not, methinks, an enemy whom I need greatly fear encountering." The sentinel shook his head, but allowed me to pass without farther question. Love lent wings to my feet, and already was Adeline's white cottage in sight, when a violent blow on the back of my head with the butt end of a pistol stretched me on the ground, and a man whose knee was immediately on my chest pointed the muzzle at my head. "Deliver your money," he said, "or you have not a moment to live." "Ruffian," I said, "let me go. I am a student at Hull, son of the Baron von Schwarzmann. Thou durst not for thy head attempt my life. That we shall soon see, said the villain coolly, and my days had then been certainly numbered, had not 3 men springing from a neighbouring thicket suddenly seized the robber, disarmed him, and then proceeded very quietly to bind his hands behind him. Have we caught you at last, mein Herr Brandt? Said one of my deliverers. We have been a long time looking out for you. Now we meet to part only once and for ever. The robber eyed them sullenly, but did not deign a reply, as they marched him between them toward the town. We soon entered the gate, through which I had already passed, and were conducted before the commander of the garrison, who, as Brandt had been placed by proclamation under military law, was the judge appointed to decide upon his case. My evidence was given in a very few words, and corroborated as it was by that of the policeman, was, I perceive, fatal to Brandt. I could not help, however, entreating for mercy to the wretched criminal. Nay, sir, said the officer, your entreaty is vain. Even without this last atrocious case to fix his doom, we needed only evidence to identify him as Brandt, to have cost him all his lives, were they numerous as the hairs upon his head. Away with him, and hang him instantly upon the ramparts. I thank thee, colonel, said the bandit, for my death. It is better to die than to witness such sights as have torn my heart daily. It was only to save a wretched wife and daughter from starvation that I resorted to this trade. But fare thee well, Brandt knows how to die. The unhappy man was instantly removed, and finding that there was no further occasion for my attendance, I rushed into the streets in a state that bordered upon frenzy. The idea that I had, however innocently, been the occasion of the death of a man shook every fibre in my frame, and while I was suffering under the influence of these feelings, the sudden roll of the death drums announced that Brandt had ceased to live. I went home and hurried to bed, but not to rest. The violence of the blow which I had received from the bandit, as well as the mental agony which I had undergone, threw me into a dangerous fever. For 10 days I was in a state of delirium, raving incoherently, and unconscious of everything around me. At length I arrived at the crisis of my disorder, which proved favourable. The fever left my brain, and the glassy glare of my eyes was exchanged for their usual look of intelligence and meaning. I turned round my head in my bed, and looked toward the window of my chamber. It was evening. The arch of heaven was of one deep azure, and the comet was shining in all its brightness. Its situation in the heavens, which was materially different from that which it had occupied when I was last conscious of seeing it, recalled and fixed my wandering recollections of all that was connected with it. I rang the bell violently, and was speedily attended by my valet, who had watched over me during my illness. I interrupted the expressions of delight which the sight of my convalescent state drew from him by inquiring eagerly what was the day of the month and the hour. It is the 8th of August, sir, and the clock of the cathedral has just chimed the hour of 7. Heavens, I exclaimed, starting from my bed. Had this cursed fever detained me 1 hour longer, the destined moment would have passed away. Assist me to dress, good Ferdinand. I must away instantly. Sir, said the man, alarmed, the doctor would chide. Care not for his chiding, I said. I will secure thee. But an affair of life and death is not more urgent than that which I am about to do. The good curate von Wilden is below, said Ferdinand, and told me that he must see you, but I dared not disturb you. He was just going away when you rang the bell, and is now waiting to know the result. I remembered immediately that I had appointed the curate to meet me at that hour, for the purpose of proceeding to Adeline's cottage and tying the nuptial knot between us. I had told him of the nature of the duty which I wished him to perform, without, however, disclosing so much as to break through the caution contained in the traditionary verses. I lost no time in joining him in the hall, and proceeded to leave the house, accompanied by him, with as much celerity as possible, lest the intervention of my medical attendant or some other person should throw difficulty in the way. We soon reached the open fields. It was a beautiful starlight evening. The comet was nearly upon the verge of the horizon, and I was fearful of its disappearing before the ceremony of my nuptials could be accomplished. We therefore proceeded rapidly on our walk. An involuntary shudder came over me as I passed by the scene of my encounter with the bandit, but just then the white cottage peeped out from among the woods which had concealed it, and my heart felt reassured by the near prospect of unbounded happiness. We approached the door. It was on the latch, which I gently raised, and then proceeded as usual up the stairs, followed by the curate. I thought I heard a low moaning sound as we approached the chamber door, but it was ajar, and we entered. An old woman, who seemed scarcely able to crawl about, was at the bedside with a phial in her hand, and stretched upon the couch with a face on which the finger of death seemed visibly impressed, lay the wasted form of Adeline. "Just heavens!" I exclaimed. "What new misery have ye in store for me?" The sound of my voice roused Adeline from her death-like stupor. She raised her eyes, but closed them again suddenly on seeing me, exclaiming, "'Tis he, 'tis he, the fiend! Save me, save me!" The bitterness of death seemed to invade my heart when I heard this unaccountable exclamation. I gasped for breath, and cold drops of agony rolled from my temples. I ventured to approach the bed. I took her burning hand within my own, and pressed it to my heart. She again fixed her eyes upon me solemnly, and said, "Know you whom you embrace? Miserable man, has not the universal rumour reached thy ear?" "Dearest Adeline," I said, "for the last 10 days I have been stretched upon the bed of delirium and insensibility. Rumour, however trumpet-tongued to other ears, has been dumb to mine." "You call me Adeline," she said. "Is that all?" "The hour," I answered, "is at length arrived. I thought it would be a less melancholy one, when thou wert to tell me that other name, ere thou exchangest it for ever." "Know then," she said, rising up in the bed with an unusual effort in which all her remaining strength seemed to be concentrated, "that my name is Adeline Brant." For an instant she fixed her dark eyes upon my face, which grew cold and pallid as her own. Then the film of death came over them, and her head sank back upon a pillow from which it never rose again. Weak and sickly, and stricken as it were with a thunderbolt, I know not how I preserved my recollection and reason at the moment. I remember, however, looking from the chamber window and seeing the comet shining brightly, although on the verge of the horizon. I turned to the dead face of Adeline and thought of those ill-omened verses, "The comet that's born in the belt of Orion, whose cradle it gilds the place they shall die on." I looked again, and the comet was just departing from the heavens. Its fiery train was no longer visible, and in an instant after the nucleus disappeared. I have but little to add in explanation. I learned that on the evening of our meeting, the unfortunate Brant, who had carried on his exploits at a distance, knowing that a price was set upon his head, had fled to the house where his wife and daughter lived, and between whom and him no suspicion of any connection existed, resolving, if he escaped his present danger, to give up his perilous courses, but that he found those two females in such a state of wretchedness and starvation that he rushed out and committed the act for which he forfeited his life. Had I but asked Adeline her name, this fatal event would not have happened, for I should most assuredly have removed her to another dwelling, and provided in some way for her father's safety, or had not the traditionary verses restrained us from mentioning our attachment to any one until the hour of our nuptials, I should have revealed it to the bandit, and so taken away from him every inducement for following his lawless occupation. Ill news is not long in spreading. Adeline heard of her father's death, and that I was the occasion of it, a few hours after it took place. The same cause which sent her to her deathbed roused her mother from the couch of lethargy and inaction on which she had lain for many years, and I found that she was the wretched old woman whom I had seen attending the last moments of her daughter. The remainder of my history has little in it to interest you. I left the university and retired to my father's castle, where I shut myself up and lived a very recluse life, until his death, which happened a few years afterward, obliged me to exert myself in the arrangement of my family affairs. The lapse of years gradually alleviated, although it could not eradicate my sorrow. But when I found myself approaching my 40th year, and knew that the comet would very soon make its reappearance, I could not bear the idea of looking again upon the fatal planet which had caused me so much uneasiness. I therefore resolved to travel in some country where it would not be visible, and having received a pressing invitation from a friend in England to visit his native land, accompanied by an intimation that his house at G was entirely at my service, I did not hesitate to accept his offer. You know something of my adventures there, especially of the consternation which I occasioned by laying down gas pipes round my friend's house in consequence of a letter which I had received from him requesting me to take the trouble to superintend the workmen. 20 more years have now rolled over my head. The comet has reappeared, and I can gaze on it with comparative indifference, and as it is just about taking its leave of us, suppose we walk out and enjoy the brightness of its departing glory. I acceded to the old gentleman's proposal, and lent him the assistance of my arm during our walk. "Yonder fence," said he, "surrounds my friend Burger's garden, in which there is an eminence from which we shall get a better view. The gate is a long way round, but I think you, and even I, shall find but little difficulty in leaping this fence. I will indemnify you for the trespass." And he had scarcely spoken before he was on the other side of it. I followed him, and we proceeded at a brisk pace toward a beautiful shrubbery on an elevated spot in the centre of the garden. Monsieur von Schwartzmann led the way, but he had scarcely reached the summit before I heard an explosion and saw him fall upon the ground. I hastened to his assistance and found him weltering in his blood. I raised him and supported him in my arms, but he shook his head, saying, "No, no, my friend, it is all in vain. The influence of that malignant star has prevailed over me. I forgot that my friend Burger had lately planted spring guns in his grounds, but it is destiny, and not they, which has destroyed me. Farewell, farewell." On these words his last breath was spent. His eyes, while they remained open, were fixed upon the comet, and the instant they closed, the ill-boding planet sunk beneath the horizon. End of section 2.
Section 3 of The Rover, Volume 1, Number 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by CassiopeiaSparks. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 6. Edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 3. Independence by Mrs. S. C. Hall. Independence. It is the word of all others that Irish men, women, and children least understand, and the calmness, or rather indifference, with which they submit to dependence, bitter and miserable as it is, must be a source of deep regret to all who love the land, or who feel anxious to uphold the dignity of humankind. Let us select a few cases, in different grades, from a single village, such as are abundant in every neighbourhood. Shane Thurlow, for example, as decent a boy, and Shane's wife, as clean-skinned a girl as any in the world. There is Shane, an active, handsome-looking fellow, leaning over the half-door of the cottage, kicking a hole in the wall with his brogue, and picking up all the large gravel within his reach, wherewith to pelt those useful Irish scavengers, the ducks. Let us speak to him. "Good morrow, Shane." "Och, the bright beams of heaven on ye every day, and kindly welcome, my lady. And won't you step in rest? It's powerful hot, and a beautiful summer ashore. The Lord be praised." "Thank you, Shane. I thought you were going to cut the hayfield today. If a heavy shower come, it will be spoiled. It has been fit for the scythe these 2 days." "Sure, it's all owing to that thief of the world, Tom Parrow, my lady. Didn't he promise me the loan of his scythe? And by the same token I was to pay him for it. And depending on that, I didn't buy one. What I been threatened to do for the last 2 years." "But why don't you go and purchase one?" "To Carrick? Och, 'tis a good step to Carrick. And my toes are on the ground, saving your presence, for I depended on Tim Jarvis to tell Andy Cobbler, the brogue maker, to do my shoes. And bad luck to him, the spalpeen, he forgot it." "Where's your pretty wife, Shane?" "She's in all the old woe of the world, ma'am dear, and she puts the blame of it on me, though I'm not in fault this time anyhow. The child's taken the smallpox, and she depended on me to tell the doctor to cut it for the cowpox. And I depended on Kitty Cackle, the limmer, to tell the doctor's own man, and thought she would not forget it because the boy's her bachelor. But out of sight, out of mind. The never a word she told him about it, and the baby has got it natural, and the woman's in hard trouble, to say nothing of myself, and it the first and all. I am very sorry indeed, for you have got a much better wife than most men." "That's true word, my lady, only she's fidgety like sometimes, and says I don't hit the nail on the head quick enough, and she takes a deal more trouble than she need to about many a thing." "I do not think I ever saw Ellen's wheel without flax before, Shane." "Bad cess to the wheel. I got it this morning about that too. I depended on John Williams to bring the flax from old Flaherty's this day week, and he forgot it. And she says I ought to have brought it myself, and I close to the spot, But where's the goods, says I. Sure, he'll bring it next time. I suppose, Shane, you will soon move into the new cottage at Clarnhill. I passed it today, and it looks so cheerful. And when you get there, you must take Ellen's advice and depend solely on yourself. Och, ma'am, dear, don't mention it. It's that makes me so down in the mouth this very minute. Sure, I saw that born blackguard Jack Waddy, and he comes in here quite innocent like. Shane, you've an eye to Squire's new lodge, says he. Maybe I have, says I. I'm your man, says he. How so, says I. Sure, I'm as good as married to my lady's maid, says he. And I'll speak to the squire for you, my own self. The blessing be about you, says I, quite grateful, and we took a strong sup on the strength of it, and depended on him, I thought all safe. And what do you think, my lady? Why, himself stalks into the place, talked to Squire Rover to be sure, and without so much as by your leave, sates himself and his new wife on the lace in the house, and I may go whistle. It was a great pity, Shane, that you didn't go yourself to Mr. Clarn. That's a true word for you, ma'am dear, but it's hard if a poor man can't have a friend to depend on. James Doyle, general dealer, and a neat, good-looking shop it was, double-fronted, its multifarious contents doubtless very amusing. Mr. Doyle was a sleek, civil little man, as any in the country, and much respected. He would have been rich also, were it not that he was unfortunately a widower, with 5 daughters. If you had seen his well-stored counters and shelves, and the extraordinary crowd that assembled in his shop, you would have felt certain that everything was to be had within. Pins, ribbons, knives, scissors, tobacco pipes, candles, mouse-traps, tea, soap, sugars, tape, thread, cotton, flax, wool, paper, pens, ink, snuff and snuff-boxes, beads, salt herrings, cheese, butter, muslins, such beauties, calicoes like cambric, linens better than lawn, twine, ropes, slates, halters, stuffs, eggs, bridles, stockings, turf, delisk, pepper, mustard, vinegar, knitting needles, books, namely the Reading Made Easy, Life of Frenny and his many wonderful escapes, showing how, after his being most famous robber, he lived and died a good Catholic Christian in the beautiful and celebrated town of Ross, in the ancient county of Wexford. Valentine and Orson, 7 champions of Christendom, and such like, which books, by the way, turn the heads of half our little girls and boys. The village shop would have vended its finery to greater advantage if there had been no direct communication with Wexford, for it must be confessed that some of the pretty lasses took it into their heads to be dissatisfied with the goods at the big shop, and absolutely sent for their Sunday elegances to the county town. But nevertheless, James Doyle would have made a fortune, if his 5 daughters had been willing to assist him in his business. Had you seen them, they would not have appeared like the industrious children of an English tradesman, who invariably think it their duty to make every effort for the well-doing of their family, and exert themselves, either at home or abroad, to procure independence. Could the slatternly appearance of the 5 Mrs. Doyle, or their tawdry finery, designate any beings in the world except the daughters of an ill-regulated Irish shopkeeper? I say ill-regulated, because truly all are not so, very far from it. Their mother died when they were young, and their father unadvisedly sent them to one of those hotbeds of pride and mischief, a 15-pound boarding school in a garrison town, where they learnt to work tent-stitch and despised trade. When they returned, honest Doyle saw he could not expect anything from them in the way of usefulness, and not possessing much of that uncommon quality miscalled common sense, he was contented to support them in idleness, hoping that their pretty faces might catch the unwary. "And sure," said Miss Sally, the firstborn, to Miss Stacy, the second hope of the family, "haven't we had 6 months apiece at Miss Brick's own school? Can't our father afford us a clear 100 each, down in yellow guineas? Hasn't he got 1,000, maybe more, at the very last penny, in Westfolk's bank? And if he, with such a power of money, demands himself by keeping a poultry shop, instead of living like a gentleman upon his property, and cutting a dash to get us decent husbands, not bog trotters, there's no reason in life why we should attend to it. I hope we have a better spirit, all of us, than to do the likes of that, indeed. And so the 5 Misses Doyle chose the handsomest prints in the shop for their own especial use, loitered the mornings en parbleu, lounging up the street or down the street, or staring out of the window, their shoes slipshod, and the turn-out strings replaced by pins that invariably made one rent while they secured another, and in the evenings excited the stare of the silly and the contempt of the wise by their overdressed but ill-arranged persons, parading in trumpery finery and French curls. Then they were perpetually quarrelling, although their tastes on matrimonial points were very similar, and if a young farmer, or more delightful still, a boy from Wexford or Waterford, put up at the village, mercy bless us, what a full cry! Such a set! 5 to 1. Take a specimen of the quarrels of the 5 rivals in love. Little good, Babby, there is, and you're trying to make anything decent of that head of yours, as long as it's so bright and carroty. It's no such thing as carroty, Stacy, and for the matter of that, look at your own nose. Sure no one in life would think it worth their while to be after a pug dog. It's good fun to hear the pair of you arguing about beauty. Beauty indeed, interrupted Miss Sally, tossing her head, and eyeing her really very pretty person in the cracked looking-glass. Oh, to be sure, you think yourself wonderful handsome, exclaimed 2 of the girls at once. I never could see any beauty in curds and whey, continued she of the elevated nose. You little go by the ground, keep out of my way, said the tallest sister, Joanna, to the shortest, Cicely. You keep as much bother about your dress as if you were a passable size. Hold your tongue, you long gawky, retorted the little one. There's no use in your dressing at the stranger boy. He's not a grenadier. Poor Doyle. Miss Sally ran off with a walking gentleman who refused to marry her unless her portion was made 300 pounds. Oh, said the father, the pride of my heart she was, but it is bad to depend on beauty. True, Doyle, or upon anything except well-regulated industry. If he would come into partnership, he might be useful, but the gentleman disdained trade. The poor father mortgaged part of his property, paid the money, and Sally was married, but in less than a year was returned on his hands with the addition of a helpless infant, the scorn of her unfeeling sisters. Stacy was the next to heap sorrow on the old man's head. She, to use her own expression, met with misfortune, for she depended on the boy's honour, but her sin was too degrading to allow of her continuing in the house. Cicely married, honestly married, a daring, dashing smuggler, who, depending on his former good fortune, dared an exploit in the contraband trade, which would have banished him forever from the country, had not Doyle again mortgaged his property to save him. The young man's good name was gone, however, and he lived depending on his father-in-law, who now began to suffer seriously from pecuniary embarrassment. Joanna married what was called well, that is, the young man was a gentleman farmer, too proud to look after his own affairs. He depended upon his right-hand man, or the goodness of the times, or anything but his own exertions, for his success. Speculated, failed, prevailed on his unfortunate relative to bail him, and in open defiance of truth and honesty, fled to America. Then indeed the wail and the woe resounded in that house, where peace and comfort and happiness might have dwelt, and the old man's bed was a cold jail floor, and the family were scattered and branded with sin and shame, and all for want of independent feelings. the Honourable Mr. Augustus Heatherton, who once lived in yonder villa, was the youngest of 11 children, and consequently the junior brother of the noble Lord of Heatherton, nephew of the Honourable Justice Cleveland, nephew of Admiral Barrymore, K.C.B., etc., 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 and cousin first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, or seventh remove to half the honourables and dishonourables in the country. When the old Earl died, he left 4 chancery suits and a nominal estate to the heir apparent, to whom he also bequeathed his 3 younger brothers and sisters, who had only small annuities from their mother's fortune, being assured that, to use his own words, he might depend on him, for the honour of the family, to provide for them handsomely. And so he did, in his own estimation. His lady sisters had the run of the house, and Mr. Augustus Heatherton had the run of the stables, the use of hunters and dogs, and was universally acknowledged to possess a proper spirit, because he spent 3 times more than his income. "He bates the world and all for beauty in a hunting jacket," exclaimed the groom. "He flies a gait beyond any living soul I ever see, and his tally-ho! My jewel, 'twould do your heart good to hear his tally-ho," said my lord's huntsman. "He's a generous gentleman as any in the kingdom, I'll say that for him, any day in the year," echoes the coachman. "He's admired more nor any gentleman that walks Stephen's Green in a month of Sundays, I'll go bail," continued Miss Jenny Rowe, the lady's maid. "Choose a profession? Oh, no, impossible." But the Honourable Mr. Augustus Heatherton chose a wife, and through all his relations, including Lord Heatherton, the Honourable Justice Cleveland, Admiral Barrymore, K.C.B., and his cousins to the 50th remove, into strong convulsions, or little fits. She, the lady, had 60,000 pounds. That, of course, they could not object to. She had eloped with the Honourable Mr. Augustus Heatherton, mere youthful indiscretion. She was little and ugly, that only concerned her husband. She was proud and extravagant, these were ladylike failings. She was ignorant and stupid, her sisters-in-law would have pardoned that. She was vulgar, that was awkward. Her father was a carcass butcher in Colesland Market. Death and destruction. It could never be forgiven. The cut direct was unanimously agreed upon, and the little lady turned up her little nose in disdain as her handsome barouche rolled past the lumbering carriage of the Right Honourable Lord Heatherton. She persuaded her husband to purchase that beautiful villa, in view of the family domain, that she might have more frequent opportunities of bringing, as she elegantly expressed it, the proud beggars to their trumps. And why not? Money's money, all the world over. The Honourable Mr. Augustus depended on his agent for the purchase, and some 2,000 and odd pounds were consequently paid, or said to have been paid, for it, more than its value. And then commenced the general warfare, full purse and empty head, versus no purse and old nobility. They had the satisfaction of ruining each other. In due course of time, the full purse was emptied by devouring duns, and the old nobility suffered by its connection with vulgarity. "I want to know, Honourable Mr. Augustus Heatherton," the lady always gave the full name when addressing her husband. She used to say it was all she got for her money. "I want to know, Honourable Mr. Augustus Heatherton, the reason why the music master's lesson given to the Misses Heatherton," they were blessed with 7 sweet pledges of affection, "have not been paid for. I desired the steward to see to it, and you know I depend on him to settle these matters." The Honourable Mrs. Augustus Heatherton rang the bell. "Send Martin up." "Mr. Martin," the lady began, "what is the reason that Mr. Lang's account has not been paid?" "My master, ma'am, knows that I have been anxious for him to look over the accounts. The goings out are so very great, and the comings in, as far as I know." The Honourable Mr. Augustus Heatherton spilt some of the whisky punch he was drinking over a splendid hearth-rug, which drew the lady's attention from what would have been an unpleasant éclaircissement. "I cannot understand why difficulties should arise. I am certain I brought a fortune large enough for all extravagance," was the lady's constant remark when expenditure was mentioned. Years pass over the heads of the young, and they grow old, and over the heads of fools, but they never grow wise. The Honourable Mr. and Mistress Augustus Heatherton were examples of this truth. Their children grew up around them, but could derive no support from the parent root. The mother depended on governesses and masters for the education of her girls, and on their beauty, connections, or accomplishments to procure them husbands. The father did not deem the labours of study fit occupation for the sons of an ancient house. "Depend upon it," he would say, "they'll all do well with my connections. They will be able to command what they please." The Honourable Mr. Augustus could not now boast of a full purse, for they had long been living on the memory of their once ample fortune. The Honourable Mr. Augustus Heatherton died, in the 45th year of his age, of inflammation, caught in an old lime kiln, where he was concealed to avoid an arrest for the sum of 180 guineas, for Black Nell, the famous filly who won the cup of the Croch of Kildare, purchased in his name, but without his knowledge, by his second son, the pride of the family, commonly called Dashing Dick. All I know further of the Honourable Mistress Augustus Heatherton is that she played at cards and died. Miss Georgiana, the beauty and the greatest fool of the family, who depended on her face as a fortune, did get a husband, an old rich West India planter, and eloped 6 months after marriage with an officer of dragoons. Miss Celestina was really clever and accomplished. Use her ability for her own support. Oh, no, not for worlds. Too proud to work, but not too proud to beg. She depended on her relations, and played toady to all who would have her. Miss Louisa, not clever, but in all other respects ditto. Miss Charlotte was always very romantic, but refused a respectable banker with indignation, and married her uncle's footman for love. Having sketched the female parts of the family, I will tell you what I remember of the gentlemen. The Emperor, as Mr. Augustus was called, from his stately manner and dignified deportment, aided by as much self-esteem as could well be contained in a human body, depended, without any compunctious visitings of conscience, on the venison, claret, and champagne of his friends, and thought all the time he did them honour, and thus he passed his life. Dashing Dick was the opposite of the Emperor, sung a good song, told a good story, and gloried in making the ladies blush. He depended on his cousin Colonel Bloomfield's procuring him a commission in his regiment, and cheated tailors, hosiers, glovers, and coachmakers, and even lawyers with impunity. Happily for the world at large, Dashing Dick broke his neck in a steeplechase, on a stolen horse, which he might have been hanged for purloining, had he lived a day longer. Ferdinand was the bonne bouche of the family. They used to call him the parson. Excellent Ferdinand. He depended on his own exertions, and if ever the name of Heatherton rises on the scale of moral or intellectual superiority, it will be owing to the steady and virtuous efforts of Mr. Ferdinand Heatherton, merchant in the good city of B, for he possesses in perfection the glorious privilege of being independent. End of section 3. Recording by CassiopeiaSparks.
Section 4 of The Rover, Volume 1, Number 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 6. Edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 4. The Widow's Grave by Edward Woolf. Our village church is a truly venerable edifice, and I experience no small gratification in paying a daily visit to this ancient relic, to gaze upon its gray and crumbling turrets, or sit beneath its low and ivy-covered porch, or wander among the tombs of the moldering dead. I fancy that I am somewhat singular in that respect, for with the exception of one solitary instance, I seldom, if ever, meet with a companion actuated by a similar propensity. The old sexton is acquainted with my peculiar disposition, and often joins me in my rambles through the churchyard. He is familiar with every inch of ground surrounding the church, and points with a degree of pride and importance to certain mounds covered with thick grass and sweet-scented flowers, as being the spots where he performed the first melancholy duties of his office, and often sighs, while with sorrowful accents he alludes to the approach of that day, when his own form shall mingle with the dust of those whom he has consigned to the bosom of the cold earth. He is a reverend old man, and his locks are silvered by the frost of age. For 70 winters have passed over his head, yet he is still hale and strong. I have conceived a pity and veneration for that old man, because I observe that he is shunned by many persons who are acquainted with his calling. Indeed, a public executioner could not be treated with more contempt or viewed with greater disgust than this poor, harmless, and inoffensive creature, both by the vulgar herd and persons whose education should teach them to observe the respect due to honorable old age. This kind-hearted man frequently reverts to the disrespect he encounters from persons acquainted with his calling. A tear will sometimes moisten his cold gray eye and roll down his furrowed cheek. He has not a relation in the world to cheer him in his declining years, for death has hurried his kindred from a life of poverty and wretchedness, and they lie buried in that churchyard where the old man has performed the office of sexton for the last half-century. We frequently visit the graves of his kindred. They are situated in a retired spot, rendered somewhat gloomy by certain dark cedar and yew trees that cast a broad and deep shadow upon the green sward around, and he derives a melancholy satisfaction from removing the weeds and briars from such spots of earth as conceal the remains of those whose smiles and affectionate assiduities would have rendered his old age happy. I believe that I am the only being to whom he is really attached, and I never approach the churchyard without beholding him leaning over the white painted palings, looking anxiously for my arrival, and no sooner does he recognize me than a smile of satisfaction illuminates his countenance, and he hastens to open the wicket and welcome me. There is an old elm tree, beneath whose friendly shade we often sit, and hold our friendly converse. It is from beneath this tree that I view the venerable church, and hear the deep and somber tones of the old turret bell quiver upon the breeze, and gaze upon the green sward dotted with memorials of the dead. How calm and tranquil is that spot of earth! The awful stillness of death reigns there. So profound is the silence that the very beatings of one's heart fall perceptibly upon the ear, and should the silence be interrupted, it is only by the solemn voice of the old bell or the wind moaning through the branches of the elm trees that shade the avenue. From the crevices of the moldering tombs the lizard creeps forth to bask in the rays of the sun. He has left his damp and unwholesome cavern, concealed amid rank weeds, to inhale the pure and refreshing breeze and the genial warmth of the atmosphere. For the white frost of winter has disappeared, and the verdant carpet of nature, enameled with varied-colored flowers, welcomes the approach of spring. It is during my rambles with the old sexton among the tombs that he relates certain anecdotes connected with the past lives of those persons, whose names, ages, and days of their death are recorded upon the tablets erected to their memories. It happened during one of our rambles that we arrived at a mound covered with long and soft grass. A plain-looking tablet of inferior workmanship, placed at the head of the grave, informed us of the names and ages of those who slept below. The inscription ran as follows: Sacred to the memory of Mary Ann Walterson, who departed this life February 6, 1800, aged 48 years. Also of Joseph Henry Walterson, son of the above, who departed this life February 5th, 1800, aged 20 years. Upon our arrival at this grave, the old sexton clasped his hands behind him and contemplated the tablet with a sorrowful expression of countenance. He then sighed, and, shaking his head mournfully, exclaimed, "Alas, sir, this mound conceals the remains of two persons whose sad history I am too well acquainted with. For the remembrance of that misery a fond and doting mother endured when bereaved of her only child, who met with an untimely end, can never be obliterated from my memory. Come, let us return to the seat beneath yon elm tree, and I will relate the sad story to you, for I am well acquainted with the facts, having resided near her dwelling when the sad catastrophe occurred." Anxious to become a listener to his narrative, which he promised to awaken much interest, I accompanied the old man back to the elm tree, where, after seating ourselves upon a rustic bench erected beneath the friendly shade of its wide-spreading branches, he proceeded as follows, with The Story of the Widow's Grave. I remember the time when Mrs. Walterson first arrived in this village. It was about 17 years ago, and she took up her residence with her infant son in a small white cottage situated upon a knoll close to the meadows. The selfsame cottage is standing there even now, but it is sadly dilapidated. The latticed casement, over which the honeysuckle and sweetbriar were wont to twine their pliant arms and shed a sweet fragrance around, is now rusted on its hinges, and its broken panes are choked with ivy and wild vine. Its neat porch of trellis work, which had been erected by the widow's son under her immediate superintendence, has fallen to decay. The garden is overgrown with weeds, and the white painted palings which surrounded the cottage have been pulled down and destroyed by our village urchins, who have made the garden a place of rendezvous to carry on their mischievous frolics, and you may frequently observe 3 or 4 of those curly-headed little fellows swinging upon the garden gate, or listening with apparent delight to the creaking of its hinges. In a corner of the garden near the rear of the cottage is a small wooden house resembling an ark. It is the residence of Caesar, once the trusty house dog and an especial favorite of Master Joseph. Sometimes a group of children may be observed examining that wooden tenement at a distance, with looks of suspicion mingled with fear, and it frequently happens that one of those chubby little fellows, upon being urged by his companions, will advance a step or two, and whistle or chirp in order to invite Caesar to come forth. And then the poor animal, who rarely quits his cell, unless it be to visit the grave of his former mistress and young master, will thrust forth his grisly head and growl at his tormentors. Poor Caesar! He will never forget his mistress, nor the kind master who cherished him. He is supported by the kind-hearted neighbors, and cannot be induced to quit that spot, for it was there that the widow and her son used to caress him. He has visited the old churchyard regularly every day since he lost his mistress, and I believe he will continue to do so until death prevents him. Upon the death of the widow and her son he took on sadly, and for several days refused food, and he would start off for this churchyard and moan over the grave and burrow up the ground. Poor fellow! It went against my heart to drive him from the spot, but I was compelled to do it, and finally to shut him out altogether, and then the faithful animal lurked around the palings, whining for admittance. I would fain have gratified him, but as he destroyed the mound, I thought it was best to exclude him. For days, weeks, nay, for months, did he hover around this place, and take advantage of every opportunity to gain admittance. At length I ventured to gratify him, and opened the gate for him, whereupon he bounded toward the grave, and whined and moaned as he was wont to do before. I was pleased to observe that he did not disturb the earth, and suffered him to continue there as long as he pleased. Since that time he has been a daily visitor. But to return to his mistress. It was a glowing afternoon in the month of August when Mrs. Walterson first arrived with her son. He was a fine little rosy-cheeked fellow, and his auburn ringlets fell clustering over his shoulders. I thought Miss Walterson the most beautiful creature I ever beheld. She was above the middle height, with a complexion so delicate and clear that the small blue veins in her neck resembled those which appear in the purest white marble, and her cheeks were tinged with the blush of the rose, while her dark chestnut hair braided upon her snowy forehead descended in luxuriant ringlets upon her shoulders. Her hazel eyes and finely arched brows rendered her countenance the most expressive imagination can picture. You doubtless feel surprised to hear an old man speak in terms glowing with the fervor of youth. If I am thus led away, it is only the recollection of Miss Walterson's worth, beauty, and rectitude of conduct. It was understood upon Mrs. Walterson's arrival that she was the wife of a captain who commanded a merchant vessel, of which he was part owner. He was said to be a wealthy man, and respectably connected. It appeared that Mrs. Walterson had married him in opposition to the wishes of her friends, and for that rash step they had discarded her. It was in vain that Captain Walterson and his wife solicited forgiveness from her incensed parents. Their letters were returned. And once the affectionate wife but erring daughter ventured beneath her father's roof to crave his blessing and forgiveness. She had been spurned at, and driven from her father's presence with loud imprecations. And the servants at the hall were commanded, upon pain of instant dismissal, never to admit her or the captain beneath that roof again. Having thus forfeited all hope of being reinstated in the affections of her parents, Mrs. Walterson passed her days of solitude in the white cottage which her husband had chosen for her residence. Captain Walterson was absent from the home for the greatest part of the year, during which time Mrs. Walterson, to relieve the monotony of her solitary life and beguile her tedious hours, undertook the instruction of Master Joseph. And it was a delightful thing to behold, the young mother bending over her infant son while her dark ringlets shadowed that cherub face upturned toward her own, and the glance of intelligence from the expressive eyes of that child as he received instruction from her lips, or when listening to her gentle admonitions, can never be forgotten by me. If Mrs. Walterson possessed any one failing, and none are exempt from the frailties of humanity, it was a tincture of pride approaching to a seeming haughtiness. Probably the secluded life she led, or the remembrance of the slights she had received from her family, might have wrought some change upon her sensitive mind. God forgive me if I wronged the poor widow, but I have often imagined that, had she been more familiar with her humble neighbors in her prosperity, nay, even in her poverty, many hours of wretchedness could have been spared her. But, notwithstanding all the misery and distress that fell heavily upon her after the death of her husband, she still retained her wonted pride, so that her neighbors, who were really anxious to relieve her wants, were fearful of meeting with a repulse. I have already stated that Captain Walterson was absent from home for the greatest part of the year, and when he returned from sea his wife appeared an altered creature, for she was then all life and gaiety. And I have seen her leaning upon his arm while walking round the neat little garden attached to the cottage, and smiling upon him with looks of affection. And oft did it gladden my heart to behold the captain fondling his little son, or contributing to his amusement by joining him in his youthful sports. Ah, sir, if there ever was an affectionate husband and doting father, Captain Walterson was that man. I shall now pass over the events of about 12 or 14 years, in order to narrate a sad domestic affliction that befell Mrs. Walterson. Intelligence arrived, and, alas, it was but too well confirmed, that Captain Walterson's vessel had foundered at sea, and that every soul on board had perished. It was truly grievous to behold poor Mrs. Walterson when she received the dreadful tidings. Rumors had made the sad event known in the village, and many a pitying glance was directed toward the cottage. I was in the habit of paying a daily visit to the cottage, where I used to trim the garden and keep the fences in order, and was frequently invited by the old housekeeper to enter and partake refreshment. It happened on the same afternoon that Miss Walterson had received the dreadful intelligence. I was partaking of my usual refreshment, and had an opportunity of seeing her, and never, no never, shall I forget her as she then appeared. She was seated in the parlor. The letter containing the afflicting intelligence had fallen from her hand. Her eyes were upraised to heaven, but not a tear flowed to relieve the deep anguish that assailed her heart. Her face was as pale as marble, her lips trembled, and there appeared an expression of vacancy in her countenance, painful to behold. Master Joseph, who was then about 17 or 18 years of age, and a fine tall youth, clasped her right hand, while he endeavored to cheer her with words of comfort, and he imprinted a kiss upon her cold white forehead, but she heard him not, nor felt his tear of affection bedew her pallid cheek. The appearance of Master Joseph for a youth of his age, was manly and noble in the extreme. His countenance was handsome and expressive, and bore a great resemblance to that of his mother. His eyes were black, piercing, and brilliant. His fine black and glossy hair hung in ringlets upon his shoulders. His limbs were firm and well set, and gave evident tokens of a superior strength to be developed in riper years. It was many weeks before Mrs. Walterson recovered the shock inflicted upon her sensitive nature by the disastrous occurrence already mentioned. And when she appeared abroad, leaning upon the arm of her son, it was difficult to recognize her for the same person. The bloom of health had deserted her cheek, her eyes were sunken, and her lips were bloodless. And traces of care and anxiety became more visible upon her countenance every day I beheld her. It happened, unfortunately, that Captain Walterson's vessel was not insured, and as he had devoted a great portion of his capital to the purchasing of a valuable freight, but little remained for the support of Mrs. Walterson and Master Joseph, who had never been put to any trade or profession. However, by a prudent management of the proceeds arising from the disposal of her stock of jewelry, Mrs. Walterson was enabled to invest a sum in the funds, the interest of which tended to support her and her son, so that they had nothing to apprehend from those miseries attending to absolute poverty. And, as Captain Walterson had purchased the white cottage, they were in possession of a comfortable residence. I have already stated that Master Joseph was the idol of his parents, but alas, in their fondness they neglected to instill into his youthful mind those precepts of morality which are so essential for our ultimate happiness through life. By their excessive indulgence, he had been taught to imagine that he could do no wrong, and as his education had been neglected, his mind was not prepared to resist the false impressions of those allurements with which vice so often entangles her victims. And although his behavior for the 2 years succeeding his father's death was all that his fond mother could wish, and such as to merit the admiration of the whole village, yet at the end of that time a perceptible change was observable in his conduct, which caused the widow to experience some uneasiness. At first she attributed his irregularities to that eccentricity which so often accompanies youth. But, as his misconduct daily became more apparent, she began to have some misgivings as to his sense of propriety, and regretted, alas, when too late, that her excessive fondness had been instrumental in causing him to swerve from the paths of duty and of virtue. His disposition, which hitherto had been characterized as gentle and loving in the extreme, was now morose and sullen. He would return from his daily rambles with a flushed brow and a frowning aspect, and sit for hours in a thoughtful mood. In vain did his fond mother endeavor to elicit from him the cause of this change in his behavior. To her inquiries, he remained stubborn and silent. Nay, he often exhibited a degree of petulance approaching to anger. Yet her tears and gentle admonitions sometimes prevailed, and he would throw himself upon her bosom and weep. But, to all her remonstrances and entreaties appertaining to the perceptible change in his behavior, he preserved an obstinate taciturnity, and while the fond mother's heart was torn with anguish, that of the erring son was daily becoming hardened and insensible to all those humane feelings which are implanted in our bosoms by the hands of virtue. I have previously stated that Mrs. Walterson was thought to possess a proud disposition. It might not have been so. At any rate, she did not seek the advice and friendship of our village dames. On the contrary, she seemed inclined to shun them. Now, I do believe that had she imparted the cause of her grief to them, they would have afforded her much consolation, and proper counsel to reclaim her son. But those who really sympathized with her, and who were anxious to lessen the weight of her afflictions, became fearful of incurring her displeasure, and she was doomed to undergo all those miseries which the misconduct of her son was daily bringing upon her without that friendly advice of which she might avail herself. Indeed, my kind-hearted dame frequently opportuned me to allow her to visit the widow for the purpose of consoling her. But I was apprehensive that such a visit would be deemed impertinent and obtrusive by Mrs. Walterson, and so objected to it. The misconduct of Master Joseph at length began to excite alarming suspicions in the mind of the widow, for he would frequently absent himself from home 2 or 3 nights in the week, and she knew not where to seek him. Many a night have I beheld that poor widow standing at the gate of the cottage, watching the return of her son, and every distant footstep would cause her to start and look eagerly forward for his approach. Often I have heard her sob and moan in that gloom and solitude until I thought her heart would break. Sometimes I have seen her, by the faint light of a candle, traversing her chamber and weeping sadly. Alas, poor widow! Callous indeed must that heart have been that did not throb with pity for misery like thine. I will relate an occurrence I witnessed. It may tend to impress you with sympathy for the sufferings of a mother so devotedly attached to an unworthy son. It was on a gloomy and chilly night in the month of November that the widow had stationed herself as usual by the gate to watch for the arrival of her son. The dark and heavy masses of clouds were driven swiftly onwards by a sharp north wind that howled and whistled through the crackling branches of the withered trees, whilst the slanting rain, mixed with the hail, descended with great impetuosity. The widow was muffled up in a shawl and bonnet, looking anxiously toward the high road for the arrival of her son. Unmindful of the cutting rain and sharp chilling wind, there she stood amid the rude elements by which she was assailed. It was indeed a pitiless night. I heard the old gates slam to and fro by the violence of the wind, and creak dismally upon their hinges, and the foaming torrent of the swollen brook, lashed to a fury, rushed madly onward, yet there she remained, looking earnestly toward the road by which her son usually returned home. The faithful Caesar stood by his mistress, eyeing her wistfully and bounding forward when a footstep was heard. But when he discovered it did not proceed from Master Joseph, he returned to his mistress and whined piteously. Long did the anxious widow continue upon that spot, drenched with the rain and chilled by the northern blast. She heeded them not. What were the assaults of a tempestuous storm compared to the anguish that lacerated her bosom for the prolonged absence of a beloved son? At length a footstep was heard, and Caesar bounded forward. His bark of recognition and joy proclaimed the approach of his young master. Nearer and nearer came the footsteps, and Master Joseph was at length discerned through the gloom, approaching with an unsteady gait. The widow uttered a cry of joy and rushed forward to embrace her son. O God, never shall I forget the scene that followed, and would that I never witnessed it. The remembrance, even now, causes me to shudder. For when the widow approached with outstretched arms to embrace that son which had caused her to experience so many hours of anguish, he muttered a horrid imprecation, throwing her rudely from him, and with such force that she dashed to the ground in a state of insensibility. I ran to her assistance, for I had beheld this transaction from the window of my cottage, and, arriving at the spot where she had fallen, raised her into my arms, and bore her to her residence, into which her cruel son had already entered. I placed her gently on a chair, when she soon recovered, and beholding her son, who was seated in an armchair, gazing upon her with a countenance expressive of stupor and astonishment, for he was evidently inebriated, she clasped her hands, and while the tears gushed from her eyes, exclaimed, "Oh, Joseph, it was cruel of you to treat me with such harshness. If you but knew how miserable I have been during your absence, and the anxiety I have felt for your safety, you would pity me. Indeed, you would. But thank heaven you have returned, and I am happy." Her son made no reply, but stretched forth his legs, thrust his hands into his pockets, and regarded the widow and myself with a vacant stare. Good God! What an alteration had a few weeks of intemperance wrought upon him! His hair that was wont to curl luxuriantly hung dishevelled and matted. His eyes had lost their brilliancy, his cheeks were hollow and sunken, and his lips black and parched from the effect of habitual intoxication. His dress was disordered and bespattered with mire, and in fact his appearance was calculated to raise emotions of loathing and disgust in the bosom of the beholder. Ah, sir, it seems but yesterday that I beheld the widow in her faded mourning dress. Her dark, glossy hair parted into plain bands on each side of her white forehead, while she leaned upon the arm of her son, whose eyes beamed with affection, and whose deportment, as he walked up yon shaded avenue, bespoke the pride and joy of his heart in being thus chosen the protector of his fond mother in her declining years. And many were the blessings bestowed upon that son as he entered the church on the Sabbath day, supporting his mother, and bearing a small clasped Bible in his hands. The village dames smiled and nodded to each other with looks of admiration, beholding them walk up the aisle, and the old squire of the manor would often greet them with a friendly salutation and point them out to his lady as they advanced, as though he experienced a huge gratification on viewing the calm and happy countenance of the mother and commendable bearing of the son. Little did I then imagine that he would become so disobedient and wayward a youth. But let me proceed with my sad narrative, and it will soon be concluded. A discovery was made that Master Joseph had joined a set of dissolute companions who had by the most artful stratagems lured him into their toils, and by degrees had induced him to assist them in their evil practices. From the vices of gambling and inebriety, he had been led to commit the crime of theft, for, at the instigations of his wicked companions, he had broken open a bureau belonging to his mother, and stolen from thence a sum of money, together with a quantity of plate, and some few jewels, with which he had absconded, nor could the poor widow gain any intelligence of him, until the occurrence of that sad adventure by which he met with an untimely end. It happened in the following manner. Those dissolute companions which Master Joseph had joined were known as a most desperate gang of ruffians. Orchards and hen roosts had been robbed with impunity, for these depredators were said to be so strong in numbers and so determined that the villagers were afraid to attack them. So, that while the rewards were offered for their apprehension, they committed the most flagrant and daring acts of robbery unmolested, and, perceiving that no person dared to venture to attack them while pursuing their lawless deeds, they had become bold, and had now concerted a plan to rob the manor house at the earliest and most favorable opportunity that should offer, in order to obtain the rich service of plate and jewels which it was said to contain. For the purpose of carrying this plan into execution, enquiries were made by certain members of the gang, and it was ascertained that the squire had gone to his town residence in order to spend the winter there, and had left the manor house to the care of his faithful old steward, who, with his wife, son, and servant girl, were the only persons that inhabited it. This information inspired the desperadoes with great joy and a determination to effect their object without loss of time. It was a dark, gusty night in the month of February that the burglars set out upon their expedition, and Master Joseph, who had been elected a sort of chief or captain over this desperate gang, undertook to conduct the enterprise. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning when they arrived at the gate of the manor house, and a trusty spy was sent forward to reconnoitre, who soon returned and reported that everything was favorable for their plan of attack. Thereupon the gang forced the gate, and moving on noiselessly and upon tiptoe, concealed by the thick gloom which shrouded the earth, they proceeded along the path that led to the principal entrance. And when they arrived there, Master Joseph beckoned to one of his companions who carried implements for housebreaking, and taking from him a centre-bit, screwdriver, and a picklock, he commenced operations upon the shutter, while his companions prepared their weapons of defense in case of an attack. Master Joseph, having cut a hole in the shutter large enough for him to thrust his arm into, retired to procure the dark lantern held by one of his companions in order to direct where to find the bolt, and as he advanced for that purpose, a window of the upper story was suddenly thrown open, and a blunderbuss discharged upon the burglars, for the old steward had received information of their intentions, and was prepared accordingly. Upon the discharge of the blunderbuss, a cry of agony was heard, followed by the oaths and execrations of the burglars, who retreated precipitately, for numerous lights appeared at a distance, the bearers of which were hurrying toward the scene of action. A great number of villagers soon arrived upon the spot, and, upon directing their steps to the manor house, they discovered a man lying prostrate upon his face near the window. They turned him upon his back, and by the red glare of the light emitted from the lanterns discovered Master Joseph, pierced near the heart by a bullet. Life was not yet extinct, for, upon raising him in their arms, he said in a faint voice, "I am guilty. My mother, O God, protect her," and so expired. "Never shall I forget the day," continued the old sexton, brushing away a tear, "when the lifeless body of that unfortunate boy was brought to the dwelling of the poor widow, nor the shriek of anguish that burst from her bosom when she beheld his pallid corpse. For, notwithstanding his vices and the cruel treatment she had received from him, he was still dear to her heart. Poor, heartbroken widow! Now she was indeed desolate, for while he lived, she cherished the hope that he might be reclaimed to virtue and honor, and become the solace of her old age. But now that he was dead, what charms had life for her? Her agony became insupportable. She clung to the body and kissed its cold lips, then gazed upon its rigid features while she smoothed the hair from the pale, cold forehead, bedewing it with her scalding tears. She spoke to it with the most endearing expressions, and pressed her lips to its mouth as though her warm breath might recall it to life. We endeavored to force her from the body, but our efforts were in vain, for she clung to it with a power of grasp that defied our exertions, and continued to weep over it for some hours, refusing the consolation we offered. At length she became exhausted, and fell upon the body of her son in a state of insensibility. After she had remained in that apparent situation for a few moments, we ventured to remove her, for the purpose of conducting her from the apartment. But alas, we found her dead. A small stream of black gore issued from her mouth. dappling the bosom of her son, she had died of a broken heart. Here the old sexton's voice became inaudible. The remaining words he endeavored to utter died upon his lips, and he turned away his head and wept. And shall I be accused of weakness, when I confess that my eyes became dim with the tears of sympathy? She was buried, resumed the old sexton, drawing his hand across his eyes, on the following day beneath that mound. And her son was consigned to the same grave. Yon tablet was erected by the good squire of the manor, who, with his dame, often pays a visit to that spot of earth to drop a tear of sorrow to the poor widow's memory. The old sexton having concluded his narrative, I arose, and pressing his hand with silent emotion, took my departure from the village churchyard. And I intend to visit it frequently, in order that I may gaze in silence and solitude upon the widow's grave. End of Section 4.
Section 5 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by CassiopeiaSparks. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 6. Edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 5. Pray for Me by Millevoye on his deathbed at Neuilly. Silent, remote, this hamlet seems. How hushed the breeze, the eve, how calm! Light through my dying chamber beams, but hope comes not, nor healing balm. Kind villagers, God bless your shed. Hark, 'tis the prayer, the evening bell. Oh, stay, and near my dying bed, maiden, for me your rosary tell. What leaves shall strew the waterfall in the sad close of autumn drear? Say, the sick youth is freed from all the pangs of woe he suffered here. So may ye speak of him that's gone, but when your belfry tolls my knell, pray for the soul of that lost one. Maiden, for me your rosary tell. Oh, pity her in sable robe, who to my grassy grave will come, nor seek a hidden wound to probe. She was my love. Point out my tomb. Tell her my life should have been hers. 'Twas but a day. God's will. 'Tis well. But weep with her, kind villagers. Maiden, for me your rosary tell. End of Section 5. Recording by CassiopeiaSparks.
Section 6 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 6. Edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 6. The Yankee Ball, a Tale of the American Revolution. Holmes Hole is a harbor well known to all navigators of the coast of New England during the year 1781, while the hopes and fears of the American patriots were alternating. A half-dozen British frigates were lying snug in the Holmes Hole harbor. Time hung heavily on the hands of the officers on board these vessels, and they availed themselves of every opportunity of breaking in upon its tedium. The project of a ball on shore was got up, and the hearts of the British officers bounded merrily at the prospect of the pleasure in store for them. The Yankee girls, although not remarkably disposed to smile on a British uniform, were nevertheless not averse to indulging in a little flirtation with those who wore the red coats. Ladies wore the bump of flirtation on their heads the world over, and it is therefore not to be wondered that the girls in the neighborhood of Holmes Hole were willing to have a few hours of gratification at the expense of the enemies of their country. To bring the lion hearts of these officers to terms of capitulation was an object not to be resisted, and accordingly these damsels arrayed themselves in their bright smiles, and repaired to the festive hall at the time appointed. Brilliantly shone everything on that evening. The officers were there, forgetful of the errand of butchery on which they were come to the country, and intent only on winning honeyed looks and love-lit smiles from the breathing forms around them. The dance went on, and as fair and sylph-like forms wreathed through the mazes, the proud Britons forgot their sweethearts at home, and yielded up their devotions to the fair strangers before them. Swiftly flew the winged hours away, and the solemn chime of midnight swelled on the air before the sounds of music ceased, and the party separated with the promise of many such meetings in future. It was too late to return to the ships that night, and the gallant officers, after discoursing on the comparative merits of the beauties by whom they had been entranced, drank a toast to woman's smile, and prepared to retire for the night. Pleasant dreams charmed their slumbers, fairy forms flitted around their pillows, away their spirits bounded over the wide expanse of waters between them and their distant homes, and there revelled in half-awakened scenes of former bliss, and sleep to them was a repose and a blessing. No thought, no suspicion had they of coming evil, but busy with the past, all forgetful were they of the power of the future to bring a saddening change over their hearts, and they slept away with the smiles of tranquillity playing upon their sealed features. But all were not asleep that night. There were others, counting on future gains and glories, whose wakeful enterprise banished slumber from their eyelids and filled their hearts with those high sensations which deeds of chivalrous daring always foster. To these it is now our duty to turn. The Vineyard Sound is about 5 miles over. While the dance was in progress on the one shore, preparations of another kind were in progress on the opposite one. The tidings of the ball were spread throughout the vicinity, and 18 brave fellows agreed to make that night replete with gloomy as well as brilliant recollections to the British officers. The moon was in her last quarter, and as she sunk below the horizon, and her girdling light vanished from the heavens, a company of resolute fellows descended the bank and made to the water's edge. A couple of boats were soon unmoored and launched on the unsteady element, filled with as gallant crews as ever started on an eventful enterprise. Every spirit swelled high as they cleared the foam of the breakers, and the crafts beneath them rode gracefully over the gentle billows. "Now, my hearties," said a voice from the bows of the large boat, "the first thing that I have to ask of you is that you obey orders." "Aye, aye, Captain," responded the others. "Then, boys, draw your pistols and prepare for a shot." Every fellow that owned a pistol, that is, a canteen or flask, drew it forth and uncorked it. All hands ready. Then, my hearties, twig this toast: success to the Vineyarders, and a bad night's rest to the redcoats. The toast was duly honoured, and every fellow took down his canteen and replaced it in his pocket. Now this is my first order. No word is to be spoken louder than a whisper between this and the other shore. The success you have just drank to depends on silence. "Aye, aye," muttered all hands. The oars were muffled to prevent a splash in the water, and onward the boats went silently. Their heads were pointed directly towards the tavern where the ball had been, and each fellow mused on the scenes which would transpire on their arrival. "I'll be shot if I call Keep Still Joe," said a youth by the name of Sam Darrell to his next neighbour in a whisper. "I can't help thinking that chiefest of witches, Sally Renham, is at that party." "Well, what harm if she is?" "None that I know of," returned Sam, "only I don't like the thought of that fair hand being touched by an arm that wears a red coat." "The girl, Sam, is a fair one, and she is as true as she is fair. Her heart never harboured love for a Tory. You see, it runs in all female flesh to like to win a heart, if it be but to see with what kind of grace its owner will yield it up. Truer words were never spoken, Joe, but why the devil a girl, when she's got one heart safe, can't be satisfied with it, is something that I don't understand. I guess there's more than that in female human nature that you don't understand, Sam. Woman has a great many kinds that are perfect mysteries to me. But as to being uneasy about Miss Renham's hand, it is sheer nonsense. Her eye can blink kindly on his Majesty's epaulets, but it dwells, Sam, on the plain rigging of a lad that we both know pretty well. Who's that? Why, yourself, Sam. Heavens, what blind fools love makes of you fellows. All you have got to do is to capture the biggest officer in the gang tonight, and that act, I tell you, won't fail to take captive the fancy of the lady. She's fond of doing like things herself. Give us your hand, Joe, and I promise you that if the taking of the proudest officer at Daggett's tonight will please Sally, she shall be pleased. I'll swear the prisoner shall be mine. Luck to you, Sam. And thus their colloquy ended. It was full 2 o'clock as our party hauled their keels on the strand. A few whispers passed round, and then they mounted the bank and struck directly for old Daggett's. As they drew nigh, they separated, and in a minute a complete line was drawn around the house to prevent escape, if any should be attempted. A part of the force returned to the house, and soon presented themselves at the door of the room in which their destined victims lay, dreaming of anything rather than a capture. The door turned out on its hinges, and the loud voice of the leader of the invaders commanded the sleepers to surrender. The room was soon a scene of confusion. The Britons were at first disposed to make resistance, but seeing no way to escape, and knowing that their good treatment depended on their submissiveness, they surrendered with as much grace as was desirable. Out of their beds they were forced, 10 as sleepy-looking fellows as one would wish to see. One of them, corpulent, red-faced, and larger than his companions, grumbled as he rose, but a hand was placed on his shoulder with an order to be as still and as brisk as possible, and he submitted. "I've got him, Joe," said our lover Sam to his friend, who, assisting a reluctant leg to force itself through a pair of inexpressibles. "Well, hang on to him." "Ay, that I will, like death to a grim beggar." Then turning to his prisoner, he added, "Come, my dear sir, I don't want to be officious, but let me assist you in adjusting your wardrobe. While you are gartering that stocking, I'll garter your neck with this cravat. Take that, darn you, for your impudence," said the officer, at the same time levelling a blow with his clenched fist, which Sam parried. "Tenderly, tenderly, my dear fellow," said Sam, "but if you want the use of your peepers by the time daylight comes, you will be sparing of your fists." "Who and what are you?" asked the officer, looking grumly up in Sam's face. "My name is Sam Dareall, at your service," which being interpreted means Sam Daredevil, "and I will promise you a touch of my nature and friendship, too, before we separate. You are a devilish obliging fellow." "Thank you, sir. It runs into the Dareall family to be obliging. Can I be of any use to you in putting on your coat? For I shall be under the disagreeable necessity of marching you off right away." "What is this silly thing good for?" said Sam, at the same time pulling the epaulets from the officer's shoulder. "It's only fit for a child's plaything," and he put his foot on the toy. The Briton's face grew very red, but he had to keep quiet, as Sam assured him that, as he was going a long journey, it would only be an encumbrance to his shoulders, and he had done what he had from the kindest intentions. To the door Sam led his prisoner, and meeting his friend Joe at it, desired him to say if he had not captured the biggest game. Joe deliberately glanced his eye about the officer's sturdy dimensions, and replied affirmatively. When they had reached the outside of the house, a short parley ensued, in which it was determined the enemy should be hurried by a forced march off to Boston. One officer, who could neither be persuaded nor forced to put on his regimentals upstairs, and who had been brought down for the purpose of seeing what effect the chill air would have upon him, swore he would die before he would move a foot. One of the captors who had him in tow now applied a switch to his bare feet, and he moved them with much briskness, to the delight of the joyous Americans and the evident chagrin of the officers. The poor fellow, at the earnest entreaties of his friends, after being dragged a few yards, very reluctantly yielded up his resolutions, drew on his pantaloons. The whole party soon got under way, and made good haste to their boats and over the bay again. Many were the jokes which circulated among the merry fellows at the expense of their prisoners, who, although in the midst of a superior force, could not altogether resist the spirit of insubordination. The prisoners were got safe into quarters by daylight, and after breakfast were ordered to prepare for an overland journey to Boston, where they arrived in safety, and were deposited for safekeeping under the protection of John Hancock. They were soon exchanged, and lived to relate in their far homes to their anxious friends all the scenes which transpired between the ball-room and Boston. The corpulent one not forgetting to make affectionate mention of Sam Darrell, who, be it known, was shortly after married to Miss Sally Renham, and lived to tell to his grandchildren the story of that night. End of section 6.
Section 7 of The Rover, Volume 1, Number 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by CassiopeiaSparks. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 6, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 7, To Beauty. Spirit of all that is divine on earth, soul chastening essence of creation's mould, whate'er thy form, where'er thy charms unfold, or at pale eve, or at the morning's birth, whether thou'rt throned in rich monarchial worth, or in that spiritual galaxy of old, the forest nymphs who danced upon the world, or chased the flying streams with kindred mirth. Thee do I worship only, but when thou, sublimed in sweet conception, art enshrined in the fair temple of Ione's brow, the living image of her deathless mind, oh, then my faltering accents whisper how, for my heart's peace, to thee I would be blind. End of section 7. Section 8 of The Rover, Volume 1, Number 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by CassiopeiaSparks. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 6, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 8, To a Star. To thee, bright splendor of night's ebon scene, deep silent orisons are gladly poured from pious hearts all lonely and serene, as incense pure ascending to the Lord. At this dread hour, immersed in reverie deep, holding still commune with the ray afar. A wilderness of thought which banish sleep, distracts the mind, and wings it, glorious star, up to the center of the universe, to wander there in space of spheres sublime, yet still think calmly of the quiet hearse, what hour it slowly moves to church bells' chime. Though earth it bears to earth, yet like thy light, the soul shall shine resplendent over its night. End of section 8. Recording by CassiopeiaSparks. End of The Rover, Volume 1, Number 6, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree.